Welcome to Table Talk, the place for deep conversations in the Geekverse. And trust me, when we tear into a subject, we go deep. I'm Heath, and I'll be your host. Each episode, I'll be talking with one or more creators, authors, illustrators, publishers, or other movers and shakers in games, TV, books, movies, or other areas of the Geekverse. Regular guests include Douglas A. Burton, the author of Faraway Bird, a multi-award-winning historical fiction novel of the Byzantine Empress Theodora. He's also the author of The Heroine's Labyrinth, an alternative story structure to the hero's journey that often occurs in stories with feminine heroes. That structural framework frequently comes up in our analysis of story. Brianna de Silva, she's the director and co-writer of The Cultists, a Lovecraftian comedy mockumentary-style web show here on YouTube, and the author of The City of Reckoning, an epic fantasy novel of political intrigue, the ethics of war, and young love. Cameron Pasha is a screenwriter, director, novelist, and was a writer and producer on the series Kings, a producer on NBC's Bionic Woman, and a co-producer and writer for Sleeper Cell. He's also written for the CW series Nikita and Roswell, New Mexico. He's been breaking news from inside Lucasfilm, Disney, and Hollywood. His analysis and commentary have become very popular on YouTube. We regularly meet to discuss and analyze stories, and when we do, we dive into graduate-level seminars on story structure and writing. Come on in and let's go deep. And when I say we're going deep, I mean you'd better bring your hard suit. Other guests have included Lou Anders, the author of the Thrones and Bones fantasy novels Once Upon a Unicorn, the creator and publisher of the Norengard RPG, and the author of Star Wars, A Pirate's Price, the book that explains why the Millennium Falcon is on the planet Batu at Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Mark Tassin, the creator of the World of Ataltis, head of Mechanical Muse, former director of the Gen Con Writers Symposium, and the head developer of the new Cool Name RPG. Let's see, who else?
Bond. James Bond.
Well, not James Bond. Not yet. Maybe soon, though. But I have interviewed Jamie Stegmaier, the founder of Stonemaier Games, crowdfunder extraordinaire, and publisher of many hit board games like Scythe and Wingspan. Brian Olen, sculptor of the world of Revelo Monster Busts, and the creator of the vast, grim, dark horror RPG. Ajit George, the Dungeons & Dragons author. We talked about game writing, education, and his contribution to Van Richter's Guide to Ravenloft, and the development of the Journeys to the Radiant Citadel.
I am Hela, Odin's firstborn, the commander of the legions of Asgard, the rightful heir to the throne, and the goddess of death.
Well, actually, that interview got rather spicy, so I think I'd better just keep that one to myself. Kate Wilson, a YouTuber, actress, host, and prolific geek guru who's now working to make a new show dedicated to the world of tabletop gaming a reality. So buckle up and get ready for a wild ride, because it's time to explore the worlds of tabletop gaming, sci-fi, fantasy, and all of geekdom through the eyes of those who are making things happen.
Atomic batteries to power. Turbines to speed.
Roger, ready to move out.
It's time for Table Talk. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the office. Welcome to Table Talk. It is so good to have you here. I think this is going to be a really fantastic episode. I believe we're going to go deep into the psyche of creation, whether you're talking about writing, fiction, nonfiction, whether you're talking about sculpture, art, illustration, all of that, whatever your particular element of creativity is. I think we're going deep tonight because we have assembled a panel to talk about this book right here, From Where You Dream by Robert Olen Butler. So let's welcome everybody on board. Let's see who we got first. First, James Bacon, welcome.
Hey, everyone.
So good to see you. So he's a regular from the chat, but he's been on the show before, coming in, valuing his creativity and his input here. Welcome, Doug. We've got Doug here.
What's happening?
Hey, good to see you again, Doug.
Likewise.
Brianna as well. Brianna is coming on here. And for his first time on the channel ever, although he's not a stranger to the comments, we've got Sable Phoenix. Hello, Sable.
Hello, everybody. It's a sincere honor to be here.
So this is the panel we've assembled for tonight.
Yay! Full
This
house.
is a great panel.
This really is. Let's go around and do introductions, so you can introduce yourself. And I've also got the links brought up. Let me make sure I have that window open so that we can show that. James, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm James Bacon. Relevant information is that I'm a former editor. I still do some editing here and there every once in a while for friends and former business associates. I cannot be found on the internet, and that's the way I like it.
Other than here.
Yeah, other than here, I guess. So you can find me in the chat usually.
All right, Doug.
My name is Douglas Burton, and I'm an author and a fellow creative and lover of pop culture. I wrote a historical fiction book a couple years back about a Byzantine empress, which led me to analyze heroine-centric stories en masse, which is now the framework of the book that's coming out this February called The Heroine's Labyrinth, which is studies the archetypal designs in heroine-led fiction. I'm super excited about it.
All right, so that's the link that I just put in the chat is to Faraway Bird. But if you're following here on this channel, you're going to know when the actual Heroine's Labyrinth goes live. All right, Brianna?
I don't remember who I am. Okay, I'm Brianna. I'm Brianna de Silva. I'm an author and a writer-director. I have a novel, epic fantasy novel out called City of Reckoning, and I am working on putting together my Hollywood portfolio. So I'm doing a lot of work on screenplays and short films and stuff like that right now. But yes, and he has my book. Look.
Oh, right there. Hold on. I'm gonna. Oh, no. I hit the wrong one. Okay, now here. No, put it up there. There you go. There's her book, City of Reckoning. Right.
That is it.
Show them up. Yeah.
This book is no joke.
Whoo! And I did beta read for that. I have not read the final one yet.
It's funny. He hasn't read the final version because he was waiting for a hardback, but I still haven't put out a hardback. But he beta read a very early, very bad version of it. So years ago.
Right. Okay. So if you click on the link I just put into the chat, that's where you can go to subscribe to your newsletter, but also on the website you can get to your book and then also other things as well. Let's see. So Sable, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm nobody of consequence. Much like James, you won't find me on the internet anywhere. So my sole claim to fame, getting me onto the discussion tonight, is actually introducing the book that we're going to be discussing here, From Where You Dream, based on a single comment that Doug made at one point talking about the Heroine's Labyrinth and the first conversation that the three of you, Heath and Brianna and Doug all together had about it, if I remember correctly, that just triggered my recollection of the book, and here we are.
Awesome.
A few months later.
Vehemently disagree with you being no one of consequence.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, but I don't have anything. I haven't published anything or whatever. Like, I don't have any credits to my name per se, but I found actually that the stuff in From Where You Dream not only correlates to my intense interest in things like neuroscience, but it's made me a better, especially DM when it comes to games, but role player all around. And I've been a fan of RPGs and gaming for a long time, which is how I found out about Heath's channel in the first place. So that's awesome. A bit of a summary.
All right. And then finally, I'm Heath Robinson, and this right here is my link to where you can get a free copy of my book, Goodnight Sword. This is the first book that has been released in the Tales of Rabavania, the World of Tales of Rabavania. If you are a fan or have remembered Goodnight Moon from childhood, and now you have a child, whether that's a son, a daughter, a niece, a nephew, a younger cousin, a friend's kid who you would like to introduce into medieval stories. I'm sorry?
I'm saying if you know a kid.
If you know a kid, right. If you know a kid, right, who you might want to introduce into medieval or fantasy storytelling, hey, what type of child wouldn't you want to introduce to Goodnight Sword instead of Goodnight Moon? Oh, PH Arbest says, look, okay, I just put the link in the chat right there. The link to that book went into the chat right there. Hey, Robert. Hey, Robert. PH says, I'm reading to my son tonight, actually,
that's
regarding
good.
Goodnight Sword. So that is fantastic. If you go to that link I just dropped in the chat, you can get a free copy of the book. That's a PDF. It's completely free. You can download it. You can be reading it to your kids tonight. Oh, Robert says, my daughter liked the art. Robert, I know, has got a copy. You can be reading tonight to your child for Goodnight Sword. And then when you sign up there, I'm going to be bringing the book to Indiegogo again, or Indiegogo for the first time. We'll be doing a campaign to get hardback copies of the books printed up again. So if you would like a hard copy of the book, when you sign up there, I'll let you know when the Indiegogo goes live. And then I'll draw for a free copy of the book when the campaign goes live. So there we go. All right. So introduction's complete. All right, so let's get started. So we are talking about the primary subject of tonight is this book, From Where You Dream. As we said, Sable Phoenix is the one who brought this up and recommended this book. So Sable, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce this topic, why this book is important, what you think of it, and basically set up the whole discussion here. No pressure.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's fair since I was the one who brought it up in the first place. It's From Where You Dream, I think, is a unique book when it comes to writing. I haven't read anything at all like it because almost all writing books out there that I've ever seen focus on what I would say, what I'm going to call in the discussion tonight later on, the tools that craft, so to speak, which is, oh, this is how you do dialogue, and this is how you do description, and this is how you put together a good character. This is how you put together a functional 3-act structure, or whatever the heck you're gonna write your type of story around, right? Almost every book gets into the technicalities. From Where You Dream is not about technicalities at all. The central premise of Robert Olen Butler, the author, is that a writer is just as much an artist as any other type of artist, and their medium is words. And uniquely to writing, because the word, whether it's spoken or written, is not inherently what he calls inherently sensual, as other art is, whether it's music, whether it's visual art of some kind, whether it's a sculpture, which you can literally touch, or whatever else. All art is a sensation at its core. We have to, as authors, as writers, we have to cut through a layer of saran wrap, let's say, between us and that sensorium of the people consuming our art, because we have to go through the brain's mechanism to translate language in whatever form it's encountered into meaning, whereas meaning is inherent in the presentation of other media. And so his whole point in the book, it's taken from a set of transcripts of some lectures he did when he was a literature professor. And his whole point in the lectures is basically you have to get into your subconscious and write from your subconscious. And there are reasons why he talks about that, which we'll get into more detail later on. But that's the kind of the central premise of that book. And then he sets that up in the first couple chapters, and then the rest of the chapters are talking about ways to be able to do that and get out of your head and get into the moment to write like he says, to write like Michael Jordan laying up a basket, essentially. So if that's I think the best I can do to summarize the book for anybody who hasn't read it. I know everybody here obviously has, so if anybody wants to add in more, that'd be great before we get into the actual text.
Well, I'll just throw in briefly. I had never heard of the book, Sable, until you had mentioned it in the chat, and there was a reaction to the book. I was like, that sounds like a book of note. And the title clued me in that it might be something I'm very interested in. I think you're correct that a lot of writing craft books tend to study the math of writing. And I say math because, there's grammar, there's punctuation, there's technique, there's formula, there's the 3-act structure. And it's funny, you throw words like formula and arc and structure, and it sounds like math. Yeah. And I'm sure everyone in this chat has had this problem, or in this show has had this problem, where when you take straight advice from a math side of craft, your writing starts to sound like it. I remember even I've
read books that feel that way too. Sorry to interrupt, but I won't say the name. There's this very famous blogger who writes her writing advice. And I read one of her books once, and it was just like so strict and formulaic and not emotional, and I didn't connect.
Clinical and dry.
Then I know exactly the blogger you're talking about.
Oh, see, I've gave too many details. You already
commented on this book. She wrote a blog and commented on this book.
Even the elements of style was like omit needless words. Right. So I went through a phase where like every sentence was 3 or 4 words long, and you would read it. I'm like, this is terrible. So it's really hard to apply some advice that you get. You try to apply it and it just doesn't work. What appealed to me about this book, just from the title, when it was mentioned, was that this did not seem to strike me as a math writing book. It's not, the what is it? The right brain? No, the left brain is the analytical side, right? It didn't sound like it came from that side. And that's why I immediately read it.
That's interesting that you mentioned math. We'll get to that in a little bit too from my notes.
Can I jump in and kind of phrase my general feelings on it before we go into more depth? So I feel like when it comes to writing advice, there's always this element of every single creative brain is different. We all have different strengths, different weaknesses, and certain kinds of advice are going to be more or less helpful for different kinds of people. And so I think it's always useful to know what kind of book it is and like what kind of person it's oriented towards. And so I'm going to say some things for people that might be watching for those that will not need to read this book. Because for me, I was so underwhelmed by it. Like, I was definitely not the right target audience. Everything in there was like, for me, like either just like very obvious to me or I outright disagreed with it. But I felt that to the right kind of like to someone who I can like, there's also truth there that I think it just, it will be helpful for different kinds of brains. So specifically for this one, like it is very helpful for someone if you're constantly being tugged in like what Doug was saying, the kind of mathy analytical side, if you lean in that direction naturally, and that causes you to write things that are a bit more dry and a bit too heady, this book will be helpful for you. If you're someone like myself who has traditionally been on the other extreme where you're writing very much from your soul to the point where you have to force yourself to learn story structure because your stories are like, because like this kind of book is going to not be all that interesting. So I say that's kind of my feelings on it. Like I'm definitely, I'll get into more of like the art versus craft stuff. I have a lot to say on that. I would love to come back to that topic, but that's kind of my general feeling on it. It was like, I think this is a good book for certain kinds of people, or even people at different stages of like learning creatively, but yeah, if you're someone that's naturally very like in touch with your intuition creatively, it may not be helpful because that's kind of how I am. So
I guess I'll go next. It actually is a great segue based on what you said, Brianna, because I tend to be more analytical. And while I absolutely disagree with him, I think that there are certain things to criticize within his own belief setting. So going back to what Doug and Sable said, it doesn't read like any other book on writing that you've read. And it's because in my interpretation, this is not a book on writing. It's a book on philosophy. If I can take a moment to read the first paragraph, I need to make this clear first off. No matter where you are in your writing career, if you aspire to create literature, if you aspire to be an artist in the medium of language, if you aspire to create narratives of whatever length that arrive at the condition of art, there are fundamental truths about the artistic process to which you must attend. Philosophy is about what we ought to do. And so this opening premise is, if you want to create art, here's how you ought to go about doing it. And I think that's why it reads differently than any other formula that you've ever read on writing. As a result, I think that it is not nearly as broad in its application. In order to apply the philosophy, I'll just call it a morality because it's easier to understand. In order to apply a morality and judge someone based on a moral code, you have to judge them against their own moral code. That's how you can determine hypocrisy. That's how you can determine righteousness and justice. And so it only goes so far as you are willing to let it. And so I don't think it's as broadly applicable as Olen Butler believes it is. And so let me, and I'm sorry for being so long-winded, but nothing that I'm going to say.
Long-winded.
Huh?
This is the place for that.
Absolutely.
Well, nothing that I'm going to say about Olen Butler or From Where You Dream or Pressfield or The War of Art has any intention or any impetus behind it to diminish someone's inspiration. I think that you can glean inspiration from the most unlikely places, from the most likely places, and from unexpected and expected places. Sable Phoenix, I apologize to you if this is throwing you under the bus. That is not my intention. But not a couple days ago, you came to me and you admitted that you had begun writing and it was based on a reread of this book. That's as far as I'm going to take it. I'm not going to give it details or anything. But when I reacted to that, my reaction was, in my view, and please correct me if I'm wrong, extremely positive. It was encouraging. And it's because I, in a million years, never, ever, never want to take that away from anyone. Wherever your inspiration comes from. I have received inspiration from spite. I have spited someone or something so intensely, I was moved to create. So you can be moved to create from I'll call it hatred because it's easier to understand, but you can be moved to create from love. You can be moved to create from understanding. Nothing that I'm going to say about this book is intended to diminish any amount of inspiration that you could glean from it at all whatsoever.
This is why I frame my thing of like different brains. Like some advice is going to be helpful for different people.
Yeah. And that's why I thought it was a good segue, because I 100% agree with everything you said. I also happen to be an analytical individual, and I didn't really get a ton out of the book. That's not to say that there isn't some excellent whole chapters, some excellent bits of information. But that's not what my problem is with. My problem is generally with the presentation and the assumption, and it's just it gets really judgy really quickly.
Oh yeah, there is that. Very condescending.
We see that. Yes, yes. He's very very pretentious, is what I said in the earlier.
Pretentious. That's good word.
So yeah, I can totally understand both of those. I think maybe I'll be able to dig some things out that might shift you guys' perspective on it. Maybe not. If not, that's not necessarily the purpose of this. But
welcome the attempt.
Yeah, no, I think that, like, I can absolutely see where you're coming from. I suspected from just knowing from our own interactions in the past, I suspected that your issues with the book would be somewhere along those lines, James. And I can totally understand how you feel like it might not necessarily apply to somebody more in the right from your heart type of approach, like you're saying, Brianna. But I think in spite of his presentation of, this, we are artists and therefore we must create art, and the tortured artist stereotype that he's kind of leaning into, I think, in his own mind. I still think there are some universals there that can apply to. He's talking about the nature of art and how art is made and where it comes from, more than just specifically writing. Although he does, obviously, being an author, he mentions about the specific challenges of writing. And like I said before, I'm fascinated by neuroscience, and some of the stuff he talks about actually ties into that. So I think, I don't know.
I actually looked up some
a lot of
neuromapping
detail.
for this. I don't think it's relevant, but I looked up neuromapping for a praying individual, a creative individual, and someone who's going through the mundanity of their everyday work life. And while there is some overlap, I think that they're all pretty different, at least in the extremely limited reading that I did, because I didn't have all the time in the world to do it. So
sure,
you can correct me on that if I ended up being wrong. But honest to God, I don't even think it's relevant at this point. It's like I have links pulled up, and I'm probably not going to refer to them.
I just want to make a little like bookmark to come back to, because I'm sure Heath will give his thoughts too. But that concept of art, one of the things that I'd like to come back to is just whether or not it is art, and whether or not it's craft, and whether or not it's both. That's something I'd like to.
Yes.
Yes.
I need to come back to it too.
That's good. I have notes and notes about that. Absolutely.
Me too.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. I thought that it was really interesting also that Sable Phoenix had talked about in the comment section of previous live streams, that to talk about this book sometimes in the context of The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield.
Mm-hmm.
And The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield was a book that I read a long time ago and loved. And I still do. And I was listening to it on audiobook this afternoon. I didn't get to read it again. I didn't get to completely go through it this afternoon. But I do think there are definitely parallels between The War of Art. Maybe one day we do a whole dedicated show on that. But The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield and this book. But whereas I was very positive toward The War of Art, I'm more negative toward From Where You Dream.
3 negative, 2 positive.
So
Time
it's
for
really the connections are there. I definitely see the connections. I think it's really important to talk about. And yet I think that Pressfield and Butler have gone different directions with it. And I think that's really interesting to discuss and to go with. So I've got also notes on the difference between art, being an artist and being a craftsman. And I tend to think of myself as a craftsman. Some people will tell me, well, as an artist, you're doing this. And I'm thinking, well, I don't really think of myself as an artist. When I think of other people as artists, artists that I've dealt with when I've been doing different kinds of projects that I feel like I deal with people who I would consider artists, but I've never really applied the term to myself.
I think Pressfield mentions that in his book.
Does he? Okay.
Yeah, it's the artist doesn't have a preoccupation with art. They allow it to exist apart from themselves, and they don't hyper focus on it. They don't identify with it. I think that's
I actually have notes about that. You're talking about approaching the mystery. Or is it approaching the mystery? Let's see. Now, War of Art, page 78. Pro views her work as craft, not art. Not because she believes art is devoid of mystical dimension. On the contrary, she understands that all creative endeavor is holy, but she doesn't dwell on it. She knows if she thinks about that too much, it will paralyze her. So she concentrates on technique, which, as soon as I read that, I went right back to From Where You Dream as well. So, I mean, sorry, I didn't. We might have short-circuited what Heath was going to continue to say.
No. That was basically it. I'm sure there'd be a deeper conversation on the difference between craftsman and art. That's a very important part from the.
Here's the thing where
I was just going to say that it continues to tell me that my connection is weak, and I noticed that last time. I'm going to reset my system.
You're coming across fine.
Yeah, I can see you fine. I can see you fine.
Yeah, you're not glitching or anything, which I've seen.
Okay, well then I'm not doing that. I was going to tell you that I was going to reset my system, but if you're telling me I'm doing fine, then I'm not going to.
No.
So I'll say briefly that I have some criticisms of the book as well. I think for me, if I was to encapsulate my view, is the first third of the book was very high marks for me for very specific reasons, and the last 2/3 of the book were low marks because I felt like almost like somebody just said, stick this in there. You don't have a book yet. Add this transcript. Yeah. I mean, it just seemed like they were throwing stuff against the wall. And I'm like, I'm reading transcripts of a college class. And I did not find that valuable almost at all. However, I will still carve out some defense for the first third of the book.
What about the middle third? Were you neutral on it?
That's part of the last
super
2/3.
important.
Oh, last 2/3. Okay. I was doing the math. I was like, wait, we're missing a third.
Oh, well, the
I
first
will
third
pause
I'm
it.
positive on. Super positive on the
Yes.
first third. And rather on the last 2/3.
Okay. Okay.
That's
that
really
math should
interesting,
work if
though.
remember, I'm not a math guy. So
Well, but now this is what I find interesting, though, is to me, and this is where the War of Art comes in too. To me, the real meat of the book mostly occurs in the second third. And that was where the majority of the connections with the War of Art start coming in. So maybe I'll be able to change your mind a little bit too tonight. I don't know.
Well, I have not read the War of Art,
Right.
so
But-
I don't have any context on that yet.
Well, I'll do my best to. Anyway, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. But
no,
should we just
on
get
the
into the
War
text?
of Art. I said regarding the War of Art, I love it. And if I were going to start a religion,
Yeah.
I would use the War of Art as my holy text.
I'm laughing. I just have
wow.
to say, I've been friends with Heath for a good number of years now, and the amount of times Heath has mentioned starting a religion is more than once.
Like, if this
Well, what did I
YouTube
say? Three's a
channel
crown,
ends-
four's a congregation. Here you go, right?
if this YouTube channel ends up as its own religion, its main religious text will be the War
Cult
of
the
Art.
Geekverse.
The gospel according to Heath. The book
I
of Heath.
found the War of Art a bit more palatable than From Where You Dream, but I have a great deal of criticism for that as well in the later sections of the book.
Well, I'll say
we
this.
Can,
So
we can say
I
it. We can
noticed,
talk about it later.
I noticed that this book spends a lot of time. To me, it comes across as a professor talking to college students. That's probably where that condescending tone comes from. Kind of like it's established superiority. The guy's a Pulitzer Prize winner. He's a Vietnam vet. It was very clear how Vietnam has affected this man. To me, the tone struck as a professor, bestowing this knowledge upon you, the student who has not yet wielded this magic power very well. So I think there was some of that, and I think some of that got in the way for me because I'm not in college like that. I'm well down the road there. So that tone always kind of hit me as kind of like, let's go. Let's hurry. Let's move to the point here, So I'll say that. But one of the things that he's doing, I think, despite my aversion to the professoriate, mentality, is he is attempting, I think, specifically to break college students who they've just read all these books on story structure. They've just read about the 3-act structure. Mm-hmm. Now they've read about the hero's journey. Now they've read this other book over here. Now they're gonna omit needless words like the Elements of Style said, and they're writing all this stuff down, and it's gibberish. I think one of his objectives in terms of where he's at is to break that up in the student mind. So I think that's where he comes across as, look, we need to figure out a way to smash through this student like cage that they've created for themselves, where they box themselves off with all the math of writing to the point where their writing has become ineffective. And just like I think the Elements of Style came out at a time when people had these long flowing prose, read War and Peace and, all the classics at the time, everyone was trying to write like that. He came out and tried to smash through that to give another perspective. I think that was part of his objective here, was to smash through the cage of math that students tend to find themselves in. And I'll just say it helped me transition back, because I went from writing fiction to writing nonfiction. And the nonfiction mind is very different from the fiction mind. So at the time that I read this book became absolutely critical in smashing through that analytical side of my writing and getting me back in touch with my psyche. So the book has a profound effect if you need that. If Brianna, if you're not there, if that's not where you're at, then this book isn't going to help. And I agree with you. It depends on the nature of the writer, the personality of the writer, and also, like you said, the stage at where the writer is. I found myself in need of the messaging in this book, and it literally was the one thing that broke me out of my analytical spell. Nothing else.
I find that really exciting.
So glad it helped you.
I find it exciting that both you and Sable were able to come to some sort of creative revelation from the book. I mean, I don't like the book, but I think that it's awesome that it's very exciting that you were able to get that out of the book.
Well, it's, books are like missiles. They're aimed and they fire and they either hit the target or they don't. With me, I walked right into it.
Well, I agree with what you said,
I needed
but differently. So I will, but I don't want to. I've already taken enough time. We can go.
Guys, this is deep dive. Stop apologizing.
Okay, fine. I'll do it.
Yeah,
okay.
go, exactly.
So I agree with what you're saying, but differently. I don't think that he's trying to smash through what was previously learned. It's a really, really subtle aspect to the book that he's written, and he doesn't really get into it until page 51, 52. But I think what he's actually doing is setting lit fic apart from genre fiction.
Yes.
I think that's exactly what he's doing. And I'll read this. Yeah. It's on page 51. Oh, I'm in the wrong book. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, that's a whole
great
observation. I feel like it's just as you're doing that, it's like talking about art versus craft and talking about literature versus that.
Yes.
Like, you guys want to just talk about that part first, the literature versus
genre. I got so much to say on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bring the war of art into that.
Dive into that part.
So I will. I'm looking for my notes here. I knew this was going to happen. This is why I was so nervous. It's like, oh my gosh, I have so many notes and they're so disorganized. I'm only on page 35 of my notes. Where's 52? Give me a second. I'll get there.
I'll get to my notes on that stuff too.
Okay. All right. Here we go. This is actually page 51.
Is this chapter 3?
Huh?
Is this in chapter 3?
This is in, 3, yearning.
That's how I wrote mine down by the chapter.
Oh, yeah. That's what I did too.
Okay.
So it's a pretty long passage, but
it's on page 41.
I'm going to start halfway through the page.
Okay.
In the emotional reaction. So in the emotional reaction to a work of art, you do not fill in from yourself. You leave yourself. You enter into a character and into the character's sensibility and psychology and spirit and world. It's the difference between masturbation and making love. The former is a self-referential experience. You have on the surface a similar response, but it's a closed loop. In making love, you leave yourself and enter into the other. That is the experience between two people who are connecting in deeper ways, and that is the experience of literature. He does not mean general literature here. He doesn't mean literature as the written word. He means literature as
fine art.
An art form, yeah.
And then he goes on, I'm talking here about the reader's experience, but we understand that what the writer puts on the page produces that experience. This is another important difference between the creation of a fictional work of art and a work of entertainment. So there he reiterates in different words, he's separating genre fiction from lit fic. Mm-hmm. The evidence is in the text. And this word absolutely kills me, and I want to punch him in the face. But non-artists, include not only entertainment writers, by the way, but didactic writers as well. Not only Stephen King, but let's say Jean-Paul Sartre as a novelist. Before they were a single word, before they write a single word, the non-artists know exactly the effect they wish to have on their readers, whether emotional or intellectual. And that absolutely kills me. And this is why I offer up that definition of art that I typed it into chat a week ago. This is why I typed it up, because I think this really gets at the core. He is willing to omit certain works from being called art, and he's willing to omit certain individuals from being called artists without providing a definition for what art is. And this is why I have this definition. Because
I think he's basically just talking. Sorry,
no, please go ahead.
Because my understanding, I wrote it here. I was like, he used the phrase non-art genre writing, entertainment writing. So he's very clearly talking about, just a classic like literature. What do you call it? Just
fine art,
lit fic,
literary fiction.
Thank you. That's the phrase. Literary fiction. And he is writing like that, at that chapter. I started to check out. I honestly did, because I was like, he is literally, everything he's saying is specifically directed towards people that write literary fiction.
Yes.
I'm a literary fiction author. I am a genre author. I'm an entertainer. And so that was just like, so that was another thing. Like his advice might be more applicable to that kind of a writer.
Yes.
But
it filters down through the rest of the book too. It absolutely filters down through the rest of the book with the way that he says that you can switch around story structure, whatever works, what doesn't work. It's like you can't do that.
You can't do that in literature, and it's funny because it's just like I'm just seeing what else I wrote about that. Yeah, it's like, one hand, yes, there's absolutely those two different categories. Obviously, like those are two different categories of fiction. And so it makes sense that you might have different kind of writing advice for different kinds of writers. But what I did take a big issue with it was him describing those as not being art. Like, to call it that way, it was very like, and it's funny too. I was telling this to Heath while we were like on our, not live, just talking to each other, where he makes comments where he's like, yes, and like he talks about desire. He used the word yearning, that like your character should always have yearning. And he says, in entertainment writers, genre writers, whatever, they all know this, that your character has to have a desire. Maybe that's why they're selling books and we're not. And I'm just like,
I want to come up with that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, that's obvious to a genre writer. Of course, that's like basic 101. That's why I say some of this stuff was so underwhelming to me. I was like, is that profound that your character should?
I completely agree with you. And this is why I offered up my definition of art. So this definition of art, which always I get lambasted every time I give it to a new audience because it seems exclusionary. That was the original goal. Well, I freely admit that was the original goal. Are you familiar with Piss Christ?
With what?
Yes, Piss Christ. It is.
Tell everyone.
It was a crucifix that someone put in a jar of their urine and then took a photograph of. I hated the idea of someone taking a pre-manufactured item and another pre-manufactured item, throwing them together without any craft whatsoever, and calling it art.
Right.
So this is the reason why I initially developed this definition. Now it has changed since, but it still excludes Piss Christ for being called art. The bullet points are these. One, it has to evoke an emotional response. I think that's pretty reasonable and standard.
Yep.
The one that always gets me the most crap is 2, it has to display excellence in craft. Now I have to mention this is subjective, not objective. So like a child drawing in crayon, like Heath mentioned on the stream, performing at the height of their ability still qualifies.
Mm-hmm.
And then 3, serve no utilitarian purpose. Utilitarian and esoteric purposes are different. They're different for the sake of the definition. Additionally, Heath, in that same stream, you brought up an armor that is filigreed and done in a way that is very artistic. Now, this definition doesn't exclude art being a part of a utilitarian item. There is woodworking that is a part of a chair that could be considered artwork because there's no utilitarian purpose. It is an excellence in craft, and it very well may evoke an emotional response. And the reason that I phrase it evoke emotional response is that it has to be, the burden lies on the viewer of the subject in order for that emotion to be evoked. So some things may be art, some things may not be art. Additionally, today in 2023, that suit of armor that was fashioned for a utilitarian purpose can now wholly be considered art because it serves no utilitarian purpose today. So art it's very flexible. It's very, very flexible. It's not nearly as rigid as people initially believe when I give them the definition. There's a 4th bullet point, but it doesn't really matter to this conversation. It involves video games. If it's an interactive piece of art and there's a win-lose condition, then it's not art.
Well, you could argue too that the fenestration or the decorative part of the armor is not serving a utilitarian purpose.
Exactly.
Because it's not actually helping the armor defend you. Whereas like I think of like flying buttresses or something.
Right.
Like those have a utilitarian purpose, but now we perceive them artistically because it's part of that era.
Yes.
Those are both.
So,
that's something I'll get into when
with my definition, it includes genre fiction.
Aha, yes.
That's why the definition is so important, because I am willing to define what art is, which means I'm also willing to define what art isn't. And within the confines of the definition, lit fic counts, genre fiction counts.
Well, let me say this too. I think we have to add some nuance or some appreciation for entertainment. The way he's using it is almost pejorative. Like it's some.
Oh, it's absolutely pejorative.
Right. No kidding, it's pejorative. Right.
Yeah. Right. Like I'm like, hey, look at my thumb. You know, I'm entertaining you. Like I'm like the charlatan. Entertainment is holding your attention. So I remember the first time I saw Van Gogh, the real one. I was in Holland. They had both Starry Nights side by side, and they did not have them behind glass. And it provoked an emotional response. And all I could do with and you were able to get right up close. I was able to look right up at it. And what struck me was how sloppy it looked up close. It looked like cake frosting slapped on this thing. You could almost see the madness in the brush strokes, because you could see the stitch work of the canvas underneath where he didn't cover it up. You would never see this on a print, but you could see it when you looked up close. And I remember just staring at it, like beholden to this. It was like not only like I was seeing the art, but like I was seeing the motions of the brush strokes when I was that close. And then you start to perceive the madness in the artist. And then you take a step back and it's holding my attention. It's entertaining me. It's not, he wouldn't probably use that word entertainment, but it's holding my attention. He's not doing it cheaply. He's doing it in a very profound way. I couldn't look away.
Yeah,
so
there's an attention investment and an emotional investment.
Yes.
So I agree with that.
What I'm saying is, to be entertained is not a cheap thing.
No, not even remotely. And I find
it's hard work to successfully entertain people. Like it's not something easy. Like I really do not. Obviously, I personally, I have personal reasons for being defensive of this, but I also just genuinely don't understand the attitude of like dismissing something like that when it's like, this isn't cheap. This is like a lot of work that goes into doing this kind of a thing well.
It's pretty tough to judge somebody preemptively. I remember I had a buddy of mine. He told me an idea for a story, and it was like he was describing. He's like octopuses in space attacking the space base, and I was like, Star Wars. That doesn't sound good at all. Like he's like, what do you think? I was like, I wanted to say that sounds so stupid. He wrote it and I read it and it was fantastic. So I made a note. I was like, never judge preemptively, because you don't know.
Because he wasn't able to explain everything in his head. He's probably just pitching it very poorly.
Yeah, it's like what I was saying.
Can I stump my way into here?
Yeah.
Table, yes.
Yeah, do it.
Because I am not at all surprised that this is the first thing that everybody lit on. I knew, I just knew that it was going to turn everyone off, because this is the geekverse. We're all geeks. We all are into genre, whatever, right? Myself as a lifelong science fiction fan, I was reading Asimov at 8 years old.
Oh wow!
Or Herbert and all of them, Heinlein. And I agree with all of you guys. The dismissive, because it's genre, it cannot be art, is utterly false.
Yeah, what about Tolkien? What about Lord of the Rings? It's established
exactly.
The entire genre.
Tolkien is absolutely literature. So is Herbert, although I would argue he's not fantastic of a writer, but he's a genius author.
He has his moments, man.
He has his moments. Boy, that would be a whole other subject.
Yeah, that's a whole different.
I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Regardless, Herbert was a genius, and he was doing what Butler talks about. He was synthesizing his experiences, working for the Oregon State Environmental Commission, or whatever the heck it was, studying how to Dune, the novel, came from his work on studying how to prevent sand dune drift into construction, and how to prevent beach destruction and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, absolutely, you can write genre fiction, and still you could take this entire thing, this entire book, this entire process that Robert Olen Butler's talking about, and apply it to genre fiction, and be making art just as much under his definition as anybody who's just writing for. So here's the thing about what I think he's saying, versus the words he's using, because Pressfield actually says the exact same thing in The War of Art, and I can read it where he's talking about this. Let me see. Give me a second. I had it up and now I got to go and find it. Okay. So War of Art, page 152 talks about the definition of a hack. The hack writes hierarchically. He writes what he imagines will play well in the eyes of others. He does not ask himself, what do I myself want to write? What do I think is important? Instead, he asks, what's hot? What can I make a deal for? So if we can step back from Robert Olen Butler as a personality of the, the belabored tortured artist and view this particular passage as him inveighing against writing,
Heath is bleeding.
because the point the Pressfield is making is the same, is that right from the core of yourself, write something that is important to you, or create art, period. Create something that's important to you personally. You're not, because that whole chapter that Pressfield writes about is like, you're not, if you're just doing this because you think it's going to sell, if you're not doing it because it's something that means a lot to you, then number one, you're going to encounter resistance the whole time. And number two, it's not going to be good.
I don't
And-
necessarily agree with that, though.
agree with that
Stephen
fully.
King
But
wrote
I also
through the
feel like
80s.
that's one of
Wow.
Like I feel like that's
Wow.
like that's what people tell you. Like if you're going to be a professional, you do have to write from the heart. Like that's not like an art versus craft.
But I
that's
still
it is
feel
a
like
craft
it's
concept,
dangerous.
but you have to write things that mean something to you personally, or it will come
Yeah.
across as shallow and
Well, Stephen King wrote in the 80s to acquire money so that he could continue his coke habit. That doesn't make his books any less artistic.
Well, that's what I was gonna
He
say.
was writing for a utilitarian purpose, which,
I was going to say it's not a good idea to judge the motivations of the particular person.
that's a fair point.
Sure.
I
Yes.
think that if someone came to me and said, "I'm just trying to figure out how to make a quick buck," they might actually write something really good, and whatever that motivation was that got them there, so be it.
Yeah, if it
maybe
gets you
there's-
there. I just, for most people, that's not strong enough to do the kind of
Well,
work involved in writing.
but
But
here-
you're
But I
right.
say it's important to
Let-
judge the art after
Yes.
it's created,
That's fair.
not the person trying to create it or the motivations behind it. Like
Right.
James just
I agree.
said, man, I need to buy more cocaine. I'm going to write this book and try
I'm
to
going to write 5 books. Yep.
Yeah, and it's funny. I've read some old Stephen King, and you could tell that's probably what he was doing.
Because he was
But
doing
it's
it as
still
a
a good
hack.
book.
And he admits it freely.
It's
He
less
admits it
about
But at the
judging,
same-
though. I just want to say it's less about judging the person. It's more just like I'm judging the advice. Like what is helpful advice to give someone who's a writer, especially someone who's like starting off. And one of the things that you'll hear commonly is write something that is meaningful to you personally, because you'll be more motivated to work on it. And so that's the main reason why that's good advice. It's like, it's a lot of hard work and you want to be like excited to work on it. And if you're,
But I think that's very general advice. I
Yeah.
don't think anyone needs to be told that advice for it
that's what I'm
for it to
saying.
be wise.
That's why it's underwhelming to
But
me.
keep
Oh.
in mind this. Keep in mind the context of why he's saying this. Is the
Mhm.
whole point is, again, let's if we can just put aside the personality and the backhanded compliment, and at the same time dismissal of genre fiction as a genre, and just look at what he's saying. Context that he's saying this in is you need to impart in your art needs to impart a sense of need, right? A sense of importance based on, in this case, because it's fiction, based on the characters involved. We don't care if we don't know what is important to these people.
Well, see, I think context is very important there, because that may be the concluding statement of a long-winded or a buildup of ideas. So, and that one statement, well, the statement by itself may not be overwhelming. It may tie up several other statements he was setting up. I don't know that, but I think that's one thing to keep in mind, because when he describes the process of writing, I think he's extremely accurate. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone attempt to describe it to the level and degree that he has. It was very refreshing to hear someone try to describe exactly what goes on in the mind, how it's synthesized. Like he had a couple stretches there where he did a very good job of explaining that.
This is one of the reasons that it kind of connects with my interests in neuroscience, as well as other stuff it's occurred in my life too. But yeah,
'cause
I
the
agree with that,
synthesis-
Doug.
And everyone, go ahead, Heath.
No, I was saying hi to Stray. Stray.
Oh,
But
I was
Alan,
just thinking-
your deep dive is mind expression without drugs. Wow. That's
Good. Glad to provide the experience.
That means we're doing something right.
When you say without drugs, you mean without conversation drugs? Because we are about drugs, so
yeah. How do you know?
Oh,
there's
I ruined
no,
Actually, you know what? The fact that you guys went right there, and again, not a surprise, but I actually think that is a perfect segue all the way back to the beginning of the book. Because
That's what I was about to say.
the very first line
well, that's the
of the
context.
book. What's the context?
I said that is the context.
We've
of the
been
book.
providing
Yeah,
context.
right.
That was the
Right,
context.
right. The very first line of the book is actually a quote by Kurosawa, which I have a whole chunk of notes just on that, because I can't think of a better quote for this book that could sum it up all in one kind of sentence, if possible. To be an artist means never to avert your eyes. And I mean, if anybody's going to say something like that, it's Kurosawa, right? He's one of the most influential filmmakers in history.
Yeah,
and
I love that too. I've just recently have been watching Kurosawa films. That made me so excited.
He's
Awesome.
genius.
Yeah,
He's a
they're
genius.
Part of my film school. Oh, I
Was
know.
a
Every time I
genius.
watch it, I'm just like studying. Like it's
Yes.
visual poetry is what his film is.
visual
Yes,
is amazing.
100%. And that I got a whole thing about this, because averting your eyes, this is going to tie into. Okay, I need to calm down and kind of associate my thoughts here, but the notes I wrote about this is that averting your eyes, this will tie into various conversations that have occurred on the Geekverse previously about the general low quality or hack quality of art produced in entertainment today. Because averting your eyes is what artists, or I put a note here, what people who call themselves creatives. And if you're an artist, you got to tell us what kind of artist you are. If you're calling yourself a creative, it's very likely that you don't have any actual creations to show us. But that creatives nowadays are doing all the time, they're refusing to engage in the realities of the human condition and the world around them. They're instead writing from agendas, ideology. This is the exact kind of thing that both Pressfield and Olen Butler start kind of railing against at some certain points. And this doesn't come from politics, by the way, although it plays out in politics a lot currently in our current zeitgeist, sometimes even violently. But politics is downstream of culture. The root of this, I think, is sociological. It's like our society's had it so easy for so long that we've now had at least 2 generations, maybe even as much as 4 generations. They haven't really been challenged by anything. They haven't really developed a whole lot of life experiences or what have you. And it's all kind of come together into this kind of poisonous melange of a bunch of different traits that's a whole other discussion I'm not going to get into right now, but it's kind of manifested in this sort of cult of narcissism that you find everywhere, where what I think, what I want, and the way I experience is the way things are, and anybody who's not going along with that is not right or whatever. So it kind of ties back into what Robert Olen Butler talks about. He refers throughout the book to something that he calls the white hot center, which is it's the unconscious.
I
right?
love that phrase, by the way.
Yeah, it's a great.
I've heard you see it. Yeah.
That deep, dark, white hot center. You can't be white hot and dark at the same time, but just go with me here.
That's my favorite part of the book.
But he refers to the white hot cinder, and that's the forge, right? Where all your life experiences have been refined down to this molten raw material. And you go in there and you stick your hands into the forge, and you got to take the heat. And once you've done that, then you can start pulling some new stuff out that's going to be important to other people. It's going to invoke some kind of reaction, right? Modern creatives don't have that kind of experience to pull anything meaningful from, and they don't really have the willingness to engage with it anyway. And so they avert their eyes from it and start living in a world that exists only in their heads, and they write from that, and that's why it's all crap. And the people in it don't even act like real people or speak like real people, and the stuff that happens just seems to happen out of nowhere. Like there's no there. And
that's an interesting application of the quote.
That's a
What?
really
I agree with it.
That's a really really thought-provoking thing you've just said there, Sable, because I was going to disagree with you at first and say, and maybe both these things are true at the same time. Because to me, it seems like when I see things that I'm super unhappy with that are coming out of Hollywood, for example, I'm always putting it down to craft, rather than artsy stuff. It's, to me, it's always like, well, they should be employing this principle or that principle. Why are they not doing it? Why are these people being so lazy? But that's a fascinating thought that I need to ponder, that if it's related to, especially if we're talking about people in that particular industry, you're talking about people that haven't had a lot of hardships. I'm not saying this is not everyone, but you might have a higher percentage of people that have had comfortable lives if they're like the second or third generation in the Hollywood industry and they're wealthy and whatever, that can make you kind of disconnected from the human experience. And that is, I think, for storytelling, like that's what storytelling is. It's about what is it like to be a human. That's my personal interpretation of like why.
Yeah, 100%.
So I don't know. I need to think about that. You brought up a really interesting thought there.
Well, like,
and that would, sorry, go ahead.
I was even trying to explain to my kids because they've picked up on my aversion, let's say, to like the sequel trilogies in Star Wars, for example. And I was trying to explain to them, and I say, well, the old Star Wars was the vision of George Lucas. And I'm like, the sequel trilogies was really the vision of someone like Kathleen Kennedy. So, it's like, for example, Rey, when I think about Rey, I see a character that was designed, this is how a heroine should be. Yeah. And that's effort to impose this is what a heroine should look like, or should say, or this is how erases what the heroine is. And that was a big problem that I had when I was analyzing heroines, is that a lot of the criticism or critique was coming from heroines as they should be versus heroines as they are. And more importantly, and I say this in my
human beings, sorry for my language, just like human beings, like that's what I want.
Totally. Which means you're going to have to
about people I can relate to, not like these artificial, like offensive.
Right. So
designed by committee. Yeah.
Right. When you're designing a character off of a menu, then you're going to be probably creating bad art. Probably. Again, you never know. But better to try to find a character that acts and has self-doubt and fears and all the things that you're trying to say that Rey doesn't have.
Those aren't those techniques though too. Like it's like if you're critiquing this character, you can sit here and you can do that analytically too. Like you can be like, this character, we can talk about Rey, for example. Like one of the things that I critique about, I'm not at all the first person, I'm the millionth person to say this, but I'm just saying, like, personally what bothers me about her is like she doesn't have a journey. She doesn't change. And like you can have flat characters and that can work, but like her particular character is set up to be a classic hero kind of a character. And so you would expect someone like that to go through a journey to earn her victories and to have, real challenges that get in the way. And you want to see her, become a better person over time. You want to see her, learn how to like start off incompetent and gain competence, because that's what we enjoy with that character. Growth, right. And so those are techniques. I can say that in a head level of like, you just have like if she was my character I wrote in a first draft of a story and someone came to me and they're like, this character is kind of flat and doesn't grow, I would not be doing it from the white hot center. I would be in my brain going, okay, well, so for this part I'm going to change, how she is at this scene, and I'm going to add this in it. And so I feel like there's probably some of both happening, where it's like the techniques aren't being applied, and maybe it is because of some sort of disconnect, like what Sable is saying.
Well, you're totally right. There's going to be at some point a flaw in the craftsmanship of it, if not handled right. I guess what I'm saying is I think Sable's trying to make the case that there is such a thing as bad art. There are such a thing as bad habits and creativity, and it can lead to inferior efforts, if not in the worst case scenario, malicious efforts, where you're deliberately making bad art. Like I think
or
of
at least
but is Rey bad art or is she bad craft?
What's that?
Is it bad art? Is that an example of bad art, or is that an example of bad craft? It might be both.
According to my definition of it's bad craft, it is bad art. So.
Right. I think
I can accept that.
Actually,
a little
yes,
bit. I've seen poorly made movies that I love.
But
and then there's like The Last Jedi, which is crafted visually very, very well. and yet it's a very inferior story, if you even can call it that.
It's a different
And
aspect.
that would actually, but what you just said there, Doug, is really important because that would actually tie back into what Butler is saying here. You can have impeccable craft, but if there's no soul, then it's meaningless.
It's just hard to define
But-
that, I think.
But that's not what Doug just said, though, is it?
No, what I'm saying is that
with filmmaking is a combination of all sorts of different crafts. And
All
so
art
that
is,
one,
though.
they had really good craft in terms of visual design, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. But then bad craft when it came to storytelling. That would be my argument.
Well, yes, you're not wrong. However, maybe we need to get into some definitions here, because what's the subtitle of this book? It's the process of writing fiction, not the craft
Yes,
of writing
that
fiction.
is important.
And
Yes.
it,
I
and
thought
it,
you did
so
well with that.
so what both you, Brianna, just said a little bit ago, and what you're saying right now, Doug, and actually this ties back to something that James mentioned as well, is craft is different than process. And this book is not about craft. It does mention craft and acknowledges the importance of craft, but it does. And okay, here, let me go to my notes and let me make sure that I'm being clear with the definitions here, because page 9 in the book, it says the great likelihood is that all fiction you've written is mortally flawed in terms of the essentials of process, not enough craft. They might be great in craft. The entire book is about the process, and so I feel like that this book acknowledges craft, but obviously it's not about it. By craft, I mean the tools and the techniques by which one brings about their work of art into a form in which other people may interact with it. The tools of the author are words, lexicon, vocabulary. The techniques are allusion, anthropomorphism, euphemism, alliteration, etc., etc. But major literary elements like theme, setting, mood, etc. are all structural elements. And that's what comes out of the process of creation. At least this is what the Butler is saying. The process engages us on a deeper level than the mental. Butler's advocating for writing, but hold on, let me finish, and then I want to hear what you say for sure, James. Butler's advocating for writing out of the subconscious at a deeper level than the mental. Everyone can use the tools, but not everyone can use them well. It's like a non-carpenter confronted with a set of chisels, right? You'd be able to use any given chisel to put a gouge into wood, but a carpenter that's trained on their use will know which one to use for an appropriate situation, for its appropriate role to gain a specific effect. And this goes in later on to where it talks about the compost of the imagination and everything. And he even says you have to take all the great fiction you've read, you have to take your own life experiences, you have to take all the other classes you're taking and all the techniques and the craft and all that, and that all has to go in there. And just like Michael Jordan going for a layup, that has to eventually become second nature, so that doesn't get in the way.
I think I agree with him, but not on the particulars. I think I agree that process is definitely different from craft, but process and tools are the method by which craft is made manifest.
Right.
You can't have craft without the process and the tools. And so I think ignoring the connection between process and craft is fatally flawed.
And he does, like he sorry, I'm not just
no, go ahead, please.
To you, but because the way it framed to me, and maybe I misread it, maybe I misunderstand the book, but to me it felt very much like a dismissal of what things that I would consider craft.
It's not. Like I can see why you'd say that, and it can come across that way, but it's not. He actually.
I'm going to come back to that thought actually. But
Well,
let James finish.
Can I make a separation?
Let James finish first, and then
No. Doug, go ahead. I actually, I need to ask Sable to repeat the last thing that he said.
Anyway, well, I just want to make one separation: descriptive process versus prescriptive process. I think prescriptive process, when I'm telling you how to do, like, in fact, when I was talking to Brianna and Jane, or I think this issue came up more with Brianna, where she was about the Heroine's Labyrinth. She's like, are you saying this is the only way? And I'm like, absolutely not, because that would be me prescribing how to write a story. And I think it's very presumptuous for anybody to try to tell someone how to write a story. I feel like Robert, in his book here, was attempting to describe the process that as he understood it, in terms of synthesizing creatively the scenes the feelings, the archetypal imagery that goes into the writing process. I think so. I guess what I'm saying is this book to me was a great example of a descriptive process. I never felt,
Yes.
and maybe I was different. Sounds like this has affected, or other people have received this differently. I did not take this as a prescriptive, like this is how you must.
I
disagree, and it's right in the first paragraph.
Yeah, he's very.
He says, and the first paragraph sets the tone and context for the rest of the book. When he says there are fundamental truths about the artistic process to which you must attend.
Must attend.
Must is a bad word.
It is within that context that I read the entire rest of the book.
I agree.
Keep in mind this. This is a transcript. It's essentially conversational.
Well, that matters. It sounds like he's missed reaching people with his language, possibly his attitude, and I think that's a terrible shame because his ability to describe the process, I think, is extremely valuable. It was to me. And I think there's real meat and substance to that description. But
I agree with that.
If what you're saying is, and I believe you, and it sounds like you're not just winging it. It sounds like you have concrete, specific examples for how you're making the case. If this has come across to you as prescriptive, then yes, that would be that he's building a wall around the core idea there that I think is valuable.
Can I give a specific example?
Sure. I'm sorry?
I want to give a specific example.
Go for it.
So I have notes here from chapter 5 where he's talking about, he says that you'll be trapped if you plan ahead. So this is him talking about process.
Oh, I was reading this too. Yeah.
This is a craft thing. He's saying that it's framed as process, but it is craft in terms of its implications. Because he's saying that like you shouldn't plan your story ahead. He says that you'll be trapped. You know?
He's saying that it's dangerous for new writers.
Maybe if that's the first thing you've ever written, but like
this is not a book I would give to new writers though.
It's not.
If I'm asked to give a book to new writers on
he intends it to be for new writers.
I would not give this to a new writer.
Brianna, you're talking about the difference between the pantsers and the.
If I can,
you're talking about pantsers. It's pantsers versus plotters, right? And he talks about this.
Yeah, but it's like here's the thing: like that may be true if it's literary fiction. I will grant that it's possible that may apply to literary fiction. But in general, when it comes to planning ahead, like a plan is not a formula. It's not like you're stuck with that. A plan just directs you. That's all it does. A plan is like, this is what this is what I think I'm going to write, but what you write may change as you're writing it, the flow, the characters start to become they start telling you what they're going to say, that kind of thing. That can happen, but it's like, it just saves you time in the long run. It saves you from having to rewrite as much if you plan. So like, but that's a craft. There's craft implications there because usually if you're planning, you're using craft techniques. You're thinking in terms of story structure. You're thinking in terms of what the character's arc is going to be. So if you're planning, it's those kinds of things usually that you're going to be planning. And so that's just an example in the story or in the book where
it's like trying to tell someone the rules of how to play and have fun. It's like,
yes,
there is no set rules.
Yes,
there are tips for how but every kid is different. Every group of kids is different. I'm always cautious about trying to pen in the creative process.
Yes, I have a lot to say on this.
Because techniques, I think, are universal, but process is extremely different. Probably,
but also techniques are the evolution of our greatest minds sharing the best practices. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes even that gets so thick that it takes someone to break, like a George Lucas, to break through all of that and come up with the new angle on. So anyway, James, it sounded like you had something pretty.
Well, yeah. So he goes into discussing like what creativity is and how to be creative and how you have to tap into the unconscious, which I believe he meant the subconscious, but sometimes used interchangeably. That doesn't matter. So I'm offering up what I'm about to say. I'll tell you afterwards. So there was in the Journal of Consumer Psychology for October 2012, a study called Unconscious Creativity. When can unconscious thought outperform conscious thought? And what it does, here's a little quote. It's not a little quote, but the duration here's just the findings are: the duration of unconscious thought has an inverted U-shaped relationship with creativity performance.
Can you reread that sentence
Yeah.
again?
Creativity performance. What a phrase. I love
The
that.
duration of unconscious thought has an inverted U-shape, so like, relationship with creativity performance. Unconscious thought is unlikely to provide creative advantage over conscious thought when deliberation duration is either short or long. However, when deliberation duration is of a moderate length, the creative output of unconscious thought surpasses that of conscious thought. Furthermore, the superiority of unconscious thought pertains to only the novelty dimension of creativity. There's 2 dimensions of creativity, novelty and appropriateness, but not the appropriateness dimension. So what this means is that the longer you are creative, the longer you deliberate on creativity, the more likely it is your conscious mind is being creative. The shorter you deliberate, the more likely it's your conscious mind being creative. If it's a moderate amount of time, then it is more likely that your unconscious mind is being creative. However, it is only being creative in its uniqueness of expression and not appropriateness for the problem at hand, that being writing a plot. Now,
Like
I am not
practicality?
Huh?
You mean like practicality?
What do you mean?
Is that what you mean by is that what he means by appropriateness? Like
No, appropriateness.
practicality.
Well, not really practicality. So if you're problem solving, the appropriateness of your solution as it applies to what the problem is. So you're not going to go and use a shovel to screw a light bulb in. It's not an appropriate solution to the problem. So if you're in the middle of writing a plot piece where like a dude is getting murdered, you're not going to want your unconscious thought. Your unconscious might come up with some wacky situation involving clowns and space aliens, but it's not appropriate because that's not what you're in the middle of writing. And
that's
so
almost randomized.
Right. The novelty is really, really high, but the appropriateness tends to be either 0 or
Okay, that's interesting because I know some creative people that have these wild ideas and I love it because it's so raw, but they seem to never write it down. And I'm like, man, what a shame. Like you have this powerful creative synthesis, but nothing to contain it.
Yeah. Well, the reason I bring this up, the reason I even bring this up is because I am not using this study to contradict Olen Butler. I'm using this study to demonstrate that human beings still have no earthly idea where creativity comes from. And so in order to sit down,
people try to evoke the supernatural for
right. Like, we used to think it was from the gods. It's like we have no earthly idea where creativity comes from. And so I don't think that it's really valuable to say you must do it this way because this is where creativity comes from.
I agree with that. I think that anytime anybody starts getting too defined in what they're doing, you always have to have a CYA. Like, this is a good idea, or at least it was for me. Like, you always have to have these off ramps for people.
I really wish.
I feel like they've turned off some people because they've boxed this in so much that he's made it very difficult to be accessible with what I thought his core message was.
Brianna, what were you saying?
I have another example I want to give to illustrate that point because that's one of my pet peeves with writing advice is and he does this several times in the book where someone's like, here's this thing that I'm going to tell you should do. And I have one example to give, and it is me. It works for me. And I'm like, just say, this works for me. Like the arrogance of being like, I have just me as an example, and therefore everyone should do this. I'm like,
well, see, and I think that was exacerbated by the fact that he was putting his own short stories, like word for word, in there. That was the part that I was getting kind of.
I want to give an example
because. I didn't really want to read a short story.
It was good though. I did agree that
he's a Pulitzer
the first
Prize
version,
winner.
The one was better than the other, but it seemed to be that it was mainly craft differences. But anyway, so he talks in there about how you need to write every single day and how it's so important because in his personal experience, if he doesn't stay connected to his white hot center, as he calls it, he'll get disconnected. He says it'll take him like 8 weeks to get reconnected. And I'm like, wow. See, I experience the same thing if I'm not writing every day, but do you want to know how long it takes me to get back in? About 30 minutes. About 30 minutes to an hour. Like, it's not that. I'm like that. I'm not ever at risk of that. So that advice is actually bad for someone like me because, so let me tell you a personal example from a very different kind of a brain.
Tell us a universal truth based on.
Yes, I'm going to tell you.
Please do that.
I want to specifically tell you how ununiversal this is. So for me, I'm a hyperfixator kind of mind. Probably neurodivergent reasons for that, if I'm being honest. So what that means is that I will get very focused on something to my own detriment. And I did this the past 2 weeks. I was telling Heath about it. I just finished a draft for one of my screenplays. It took me 2 weeks. I did not sleep properly. I did not eat properly. All I could think about all the time was this thing. And sometimes it can get really bad if I'm getting too focused. My worst example was about a year ago. I one day spent 15 hours in a day just working on a screenplay. I think I took 3 breaks total. I mean, at all, like getting up to drink water, like it was bad. Like for me, sometimes I have to force myself to step away from projects so that I don't do it to my own detriment, just because that is what my brain likes to do.
It's hyper focus. I love it.
It's hyper focus. It's useful. It can be practical, but it's hard when you're not a full-time writer and you have other responsibilities. So
it was not, the appropriateness was falling.
Right. So it's like, so I can't write every single day. I have to take breaks. I have to pull myself away. There can be negative results just because that's how I'm wired. And like I was saying, I feel like I'm always connected to that thing. If I'm just doing dishes, my mind wandering, I'm walking, whatever, I start thinking about stories. So for someone, so I'd say that just to say, it's like people are different. And so, different advice will work for different kinds of people. And I just would like it to be framed, that kind of advice be framed more that way. Be like, hey, this is what works for me. It's like, cool. And then you can try that. And if it doesn't work for you, then you don't do it.
It is important.
All writing advice that's about the process should be framed that way, in my opinion.
Well, I agree.
He also contradicts.
He does say that.
I can wait.
Go ahead, say it.
But all those qualifications you just put in there, Butler actually does say all that stuff in chapter 5 as well. It's like, for me, it feels like if this system gives the writer that this system, he's talking about the specifically the note card system, right? And number one, before this, he mentions that he's never used it the same way twice himself. And then for me, it feels as if this system gives the writer something that she loses doing a draft. But ultimately, you've got to get into your own personal white hot center and get rid of anything in your process that interferes with that. If it means getting rid of draft writing, you get rid of it. If it means getting rid of dreamstorming, you get rid of that. So yes, you're right in that it's like, here's an example. Here's a process. By the way, I use this process differently every time, and so should you. So yeah, you're entirely right. I 100% agree with you, Brianna. I think he says the same thing, even though, again, it's presented in a lecture, so he's giving concrete examples of this is how it worked this way this time.
He does say that, but I feel like then he goes on to explain in a very weighted fashion why his method is better or best. Additionally, to get back to what you said, Brian, about him saying write every day. That's great advice. That's like creative writing 101.
Pressfield says the same thing, actually.
Yeah, well, it's creative writing 101 to say write every day. Right. But then I feel like Olen Butler goes on to mildly contradict himself. It's not a hard check, but it's a mild contradiction when he says, oh yeah, you're not ready to write yet. You're not ready to write yet. You're not ready to write. Okay, 8 weeks in. Okay, go ahead and write. It's like, you just told me to write every day, guy.
Critical mass when all of a sudden it's time to write.
Right.
No,
that's why I say mild, because there's a qualification there, and I get that. It's still a very strange way to formulate.
Let's also make something clear too, though, is that what Butler is talking about in this book is not creating a story. He's talking about creating an art object, is what he calls it. So when he's talking about you're ready to write, he even gives like, okay, go and journal, do sense impressions, write something, anything every day. But when he's saying once you get a critical mass, then you're ready to write. Now you're ready to write your art object, is what he's saying.
I would say the core
Again, this book
message
has
of
nothing to do with story as far as structure or,
Well, no, it wouldn't, because
plot or anything
lit fic
goes.
doesn't have a structure. It's not genre fiction, and that's so he's not speaking to genre fiction. That doesn't mean someone who writes genre fiction can't get something out of the book. But insofar as we're following his language and instruction, it seems to be only exclusively for lit fic writers, which isn't that you can't pin down a lit fic book. It's very like it dips into 75 different genres. It uses, you know, a million different character types, but you can't really pin it down. And I think that's why he speaks that way, which may be great advice for a lit fic author.
Yeah.
But
he even says, I'm using summary and abstraction and analysis in order to teach you how to inveigh against a summary and abstraction and analysis. His whole point is don't do what I'm doing right now when you're in the process of creating, because it's counterproductive.
And there's a learning curve for every writer. I mean, you have to write at some point in your life 400 pages that go nowhere to learn the value of structure. You have to write, the one chapter that you abandon to learn the value of persistence. Like there is a process, and then one day, you're doing a lot more right than you're doing wrong. In my opinion, the core message of this book, From Where You Dream, is to remind writers, specifically writers, that the powerful part of your creative side is going to come not from structure, not from formula, not from genre, whatever those might be. Those are going to be there, but the most powerful part of it is going to come from your psyche, and you have to learn to train yourself to identify when that's coming up and learn to use it. I think that's a very important message, because it reminds you of where the power of your creativity is coming from. And that's why the book is called From Where You Dream, because he's talking about that piece, that part, that magical part that I think we've all agreed no one can even define where creativity comes from. Like, we have ideas, but it's really hard to pin down. He reminded me that the power that you have as a creative, as a writer, is going to come from that archetypal projection that comes up that you can't get out of your mind. That's the thing you want to put into a chapter. And then you bring in structure. Then you bring in your genre. You bring all that stuff back in. But
the tools of the craft
comes from your psyche.
I don't disagree.
I can.
And actually, this is the perfect segue to, Doug, to what started this. What brought us all here
Sable, I
tonight
think
in the
Heath
first
had
place.
something he wanted to say
What you're
first.
talking about right
Go
there.
ahead, Sable.
is when-
I'll jump in. Go ahead, Sable.
Oh, have you been champing at the bit, Heath?
Go ahead.
Your video on
Go ahead.
mine is
No,
frozen,
that's
so I
fine. Go
can't
ahead.
see your reactions, Heath.
Oh, he's frozen. Oh,
Okay.
I can see
On my end, it's
okay.
Heath's video is not moving a lot. So,
There it is.
But back, like I mentioned, I think it was the first time you, Brianna, and Heath were all three talking about the Heroines Labyrinth together. You used the phrase story tarot, and that immediately called up what is on page 95 here and From Where You Dream, where he's talking about putting out all of the index cards with all the scenes. And he says, I've never used the cards in the same way twice. Maybe they operate for me like a tarot deck. But this is fundamental. Keep it open, fluid. Realize that nothing you do here is locked in. It's got to stay subordinate to the trance state in order to work.
Unless you're writing genre fiction and you have a structure that you have to abide by.
exactly.
But here's my point.
Does
going to happen? If you're a genre, like let's say you want to write a crime drama, the genre is going to be natural for you. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be writing in it. It's something that you're drawn to. There are certain expectations to genre. There are certain nuances to genres. So I think those. What I feel like he was saying is those you are bringing to the table from the outside world to help you craft your story. But the thing that comes up and out from inside is still going to be the driving power of it. It's important to remember that, because I think a lot of us writers, we get lost in the bringing the stuff in from the outside to help us with our stories, to find that thing that triggers it. And sometimes we lose that connection. And that is what happened to me when I tried to go back to writing fiction. I had so many, I was like, I wrote a book before this, I could do. No, it doesn't help. You know, you're always at square one. So
Right.
this got me to the point where I realized that I need to reconnect with something internal. And I got an image in my head that I couldn't get out. And I was like, oh, that's it. This is the power. This is where and then all that stuff from the outside comes in to help me steer it in.
And
Like
that's,
you said, go ahead.
well, earlier, I that's why I said, like, I'm never going to begrudge someone who finds inspiration in this book or in any book or in, you know, a friend or an enemy or a loved one, or because, you know, I read the book and I didn't take it that same way. I, you know, whether or not that's the actual words he said, he may have said something to you that you needed to hear. And that's perfectly valid.
Inspiration comes from so many places. I've gotten inspiration reading dry science books and dry history books that have like blown my mind. Anyway.
I mean, all of us here, I'm sure, haven't you gotten inspiration from terrible movies? You're like, oh, I would do it differently. And then pretty soon your mind is working and working.
Dude, there was a movie playing. I wasn't listening to it. I just saw it playing in the background. And there was one scene from it that inspired a whole story for me.
There you go.
I went and watched the movie. I was like, this is so stupid. But there's one part of a scene inspired a whole story. Yes.
So Heath, you wanted to say something, I think?
Yeah. Am I frozen? But do I need to reset myself?
I can see you fine.
Okay. Well, yeah, there were. I don't want to take the conversation backwards in any different way, but let me
do
it. With what?
Yeah, why not?
Okay. Well, there are multiple things to go with that. Let me talk about the rearranging of the index cards. Because that reminded me actually of somebody else. Her name is Roz Morris, and she has a series of books on writing, which is one that I've read. It's called How to Nail Your Novel. And she's also an advocate of that kind of method. She's like, write down things that you want to happen on your index cards. And then this is going to strike you. And you would think that these are going to happen in this structure. But then she's actually an advocate of taking them and deliberately shuffling them up, which is why she wants them to be cards.
The same thing.
And just shuffle them up. And then, okay, you thought this happens and this happens and this happens. But how would it change if this had happened first? You know, and this is still very much in a formulation kind of stage, because you've got to get to the structure like you were talking about, James, especially if you can do like a 3-act structure. But when you're still in that very formative kind of stage, she's saying like the cards might help you shake things up.
Yeah, and I think that the scenes themselves are very morphic. You know, one scene could potentially be a call to action, or it could potentially be, you know, some sort of threshold guardian encounter. Like, it depends on where the scene appears. It depends on what the hero is gaining. But at the same time, it is its place in the structure that will determine what that scene morphs into, in my view. With genre fiction, I guess.
With genre fiction. So on the subject of genre fiction, so we get to come back to, because I had something to say on that, because but I didn't want to move us backwards. Is that one of the reasons that I was so glad that I had read this book and that Sable had recommended it, From Where You Dream, is because it had been so opposite to some of the other stories or other books on writing that I had read.
Counter wisdom.
And exactly, read the counter wisdom. Specifically, the counter wisdom being the dynamics of story creation by Drake, and also The Secrets of Story by Matt Bird. And so they were very counter to what is actually being expressed here in this book, but I had never read, you know, it being expressed in the as a primary author before, which I thought was absolutely fantastically interesting. I've talked to Drake before on the channel a little bit more than a year ago, and I want him to come back. He's the author over here, Maxwell Alexander Drake. And actually, we had a discussion about what genre fiction was, and specifically what also literary fiction was. And Megan asked him, so wait, what do you mean by literary fiction? And he flat out said, everything you would never read unless you were forced to in college.
Not wrong.
That's a little uncharitable.
right. But he is a guy who attacks.
There are definitely people out there that read literary fiction for fun. I had a coworker once that was like that.
So there might be a few people, but that was his attack. That he was like, if you're forced to read it in college, you're reading literary fiction. If it's something you would actually pick up and buy at the bookstore, you're reading genre fiction. And he's like, you know, he's all about that and everything that he's.
True.
That's like the exact opposite of what we were describing.
Up until the early 20th century, or maybe it was the 19th century, there was no distinction between genre fiction and literary fiction. It was just, I wrote a story. But they developed these categories because it made books more marketable. Like, oh, well, what genre is it? Or is it lit fic? And that's where it came from. So,
it's a side effect of just having so many stories that you can
Yes.
categorize them and that you can
Yeah.
have tastes that you specifically want certain kinds of stories and whatnot.
Yeah, and
I think it also helps them figure out who's reading each category. You know.
oh,
to market.
absolutely.
But it also, so it leads me back to what you said a long time ago, which sounds like I don't go back to the beginning. When you're talking about, Doug, who is this written for? And you were talking about, is this written for a particular student who has had structure hammered into them and those kinds of things. And I'm not sure, because I personally have never taught like undergraduate writing classes, so I don't know. But from reading these other books over here, it seemed very much that when they're talking about that students are coming into undergraduate writing courses, they seem to be very much into the, I'm going to pull my writing out of my dreams, and you know, and this is, and isn't it great? And this is creative writing, and so can it ever be wrong? And this, and so those books over here are absolutely hammering against that. So I don't know who's ultimately right, but
they might be both wrong and right.
Well, here's the thing about that, and I'm going to flip a switch now, and I'm going to start talking nice about the book.
Okay.
What?
Regardless of what I have initially said, I think that Olen Butler's view is valid for this reason. Now that the five of us have read the book, and there's the War of Art, and there's the Counter Wisdom books that you just showed, we are becoming a singularity of learning on how to write effectively. There are going to be things that we each take as individuals, that we each leave as individuals, and there is value in the disagreement. There's value in the agreement. There's value in taking away what we are able to take away. And so I don't at all ever want to say it's a bad book, I'm not going to recommend it, because I don't think it's a bad book, and I would recommend it. It would just be a very specific circumstance to a very specific audience that I would recommend it. But you know, moving forward, when you write your book on how to write, Doug or Heath or Brianna or Sable, then you're going to incorporate all of these ideas and distill it into a new style that's your very own, that's going to help people in the future moving forward with how they want to write. And so in that regard, there is much value. Also, chapters 3, Holy, is excellent. Chapter 4, Holy, is excellent. The whole thing from start to finish. Though I do think it's funny that he uses both Dickens and Hemingway as his examples. When in the very first chapter he starts to say, don't say you want to make money, don't say you want to be an author, don't say you want to do this. And then the two, I would argue, largest examples that he picks both got right. They both either wrote and got paid by the word or by installment. I just think that's a funny juxtaposition. It doesn't invalidate anything he said. I just find that humorous.
Yeah.
Well, I will say,
talking about the cinema of the mind, right?
Yeah.
That's a fan. Yeah.
Best chapter in the book.
Which also struck me as a technique.
I agree.
That's where he goes back to Kurosawa tie-in as well, because he's all talking about how you're spooling up that cinema projector in your mind every time you open up the book, and how every technique that you see in film is employed in good fiction, including the one which cannot be employed in film, fast motion, but can be done to invoke a particular emotional response in literature.
It can be done in film, but I would argue that it could be done.
Well, it can be done in film for comedic effect. If you want the comedic effect,
I think that the omission of the mundane tends to be fast motion. For example, in Heat, when Al Pacino comes upon Robert De Niro, he's chasing him, comes upon Robert De Niro.
That's montage, though, like cutting out parts.
Well,
yeah, but
hold on. He gets to him. He says, "Yo, we should meet sometime," and then boom, they're in the diner.
That's montage.
There's no parking. That's what
Butler calls montage.
Oh, I hated the way he used that word though, because the montage.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, it's not entirely
different.
Yeah, so you should have called that something else.
But I would absolutely. But that's a cut. I would call this fast motion, because you immediately jump to the most materially significant point in the story that follows naturally from the previous point. So I personally would view that as fast motion. That's a personal view. Whether or not anyone else uses it that way is totally up to them. So that's fine.
Well, but we've seen the opposite work too. I think,
Which, by the way, just a quick. Sorry. We'll pick up right in whatever Doug's sentence was. I just wanted to say that when we're close to wrapping up, I'd like to bring in the author that I mentioned a while back, Rosemary Sutcliffe, who and read the first 4.5-ish pages of the first book of the Eagle of the Night trilogy, where she does everything that Robert Olen Butler talks about in this book all in once, and use it as a concrete example of that, of how this works. But what were you saying, Doug? Sorry,
I forgot.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to say
that's okay.
Just going back to these other books, I want to say very quickly that I hope Drake will come on. But when we were talking about the difference between experiencing something, like some of these books over here, like The Secrets of Story and Dynamic Story Creation, they talk about the experience in like an undergraduate course and in writing, and how they have to shake somebody out of that dreamlike. I mean, I guess it's the dreamlike kind of thing. They're like, listen, what are people going to pay you to write? And they'll talk about, they give specific examples of great television shows. And they're like, listen, I want you to write something as great as that TV show. And then they'll have students who are like, write something as good as a TV show. That's just on TV. I'm a creative writing major. I'm supposed to be writing all of this, and that's just something that's on TV. But these guys are trying to hammer them the exact opposite way. That like, this is something that people loved on television. It had mass appeal. People thought it was fantastic.
But that's practical advice.
Well, there's two reasons for that. Number one, they divorce practicality in these classes from the act of writing, which I think is completely erroneous. And two, at some point along the way, genre fiction actually flipped with lit fic, and it became more important culturally than literary fiction has been. And there are studies and talks about that, but I think those are the two reasons why. And so when you go into a college class and the teachers are literary fiction authors and they give you their literary fiction take, and then you go into the world and you try to write something, it's like, well, A, they've divorced practicality from it, and B, they didn't tell you what the most important thing to write is these days.
Yeah, well, I think it's always
actually.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No. Go, Doug. I interrupted you last time.
Well, real briefly, I think it's always dangerous to push one way or the other as a teacher. I think it's always good to let the creative person kind of figure out where they want to be, because I've met people who are so turned off by the idea that you're going to make money from writing that they're always in their head, and they're so esoteric, and they think of themselves as fine. I write fine literature, but they're not really doing anything. They're not really writing. They're always in their head about it because they've been told that, if you make money off of it, you're some sort of a con, you've sold out or something. And then you get the other side where you tell people that you have to be a fine artist, and that turns them, so I think you let people find their comfort zone with the practical side and the artistic side, and let them plug in where they feel right,
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead, Sable. I got a comment after that. Go ahead, Sable.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go ahead and go with this. Although I think I could pick it up anywhere. Go ahead and do your thing, Heath, and then I'll come in after.
Okay. Well, I was going to make a note on this idea about theory versus practicality, because this is something that I've thought about as a college professor. It's not exactly the same thing as theory versus practicality, because we're talking about literary versus genre or whatever. But it seems like there's some similar elements that students will be like, that professors will often want to talk about the theory of. Of course, I was in geography, so geographic information systems. What's the underlying structure behind things and our theory and all of this. And then I've also been on the other side of it with the students who are like, "Can you teach me how to do something?" And there's conflict there. And so my answer in my particular profession was always, you have to learn how to do both. You got to learn the theory and you've got to learn the practicality. And if we're only teaching the theory, and when these students graduate from college and they can't actually do anything that gets them a job, that's a problem.
Yeah, how are you going to eat?
And
Mhm.
That-
likewise, if we only teach, but if we
Yeah.
only teach the practical, then you can get very focused, in my case, on particular software packages, and when particular software packages changes, then you're out of date. So what do you need? You
Yeah.
actually do need some theory, so that if your software packages change, you still understand the theory of what you're actually trying to do.
Yeah, the creativity
I'm-
at the core might get
Makes sense.
smothered.
I'm glad I let you go first, actually,
Okay.
Heath, because that just leads perfect. That's all summed up in this other big chunk of notes I have here now that's kind of leading into. Because what Butler's talking about, he actually talks about how other professors in the college where he is, they have all of that, like they have their classes talking about structure and talking about the nitty gritty mechanics and everything. And so his whole purpose is to give that other. He designed the entire set of lectures to give that other aspect of it, like you guys are talking about. You got to have
Yeah, that's
both. And the and I think that it's valuable to take out of from where you dream the core, because the whole reason, whether it's what he calls genre fiction, or whether it's lit fic, or whether it's film or music, or whatever else, the reason you're making a piece of art is to get some kind of interaction and reaction from the person who is experiencing the end product, right? And you feel like, as an artist, in a way, artists have the biggest egos of all, because we have something important to say and we must share it. Which, yeah, absolutely, because you're a human, you have something important to say about
Also
your experience as being a
neurotic.
human, and you want to, yeah, neurotic, sure, but the whole reason is that you have experienced a particular emotion, and you want that to be, you want to share it. That's what it breaks down to. And Butler makes a point about artists being about artists in general, not just authors, being, like I mentioned before, being sensualists, right? Like it says, like everyone else on this planet, you encounter the world out there primarily in your bodies, moment to moment, through your senses. And everything else derives from that. You're a creature of the senses. And actually, I want to tie this into the War of Art too, where it talks about ego versus self and all of that kind of stuff. Because our interface with the world is the senses, but then our experience of the world is the emotions that those senses that we experience in response to those senses, right? So he says everything else derives from that. You're a creature of your senses. And all that stuff that follows in the mind, the analysis, the rationalization, abstraction, interpretation, it follows after that point of contact, but you experience it moment to moment through your senses of emotion. And then he talks about, going back to the whole, everybody here just in the last 10 minutes was talking about going up into your head. The theologians have their dogma, and the philosophers their theories, and the scientists their scientific principles, and the psychoanalysts have their Jungian or Freudian insights, but those modes of expression and understanding, the artist says, that doesn't make sense to me. That's not the terms in which I intuit the world. And then I'm going tying back to what you said earlier about mathematics, right, Doug?
Unless you're Leonardo.
This makes me think of theoretical mathematics, like incredibly intelligent, like theoretical mathematics being like trig and all that other stuff is like, specifically I thought of cosmology, right? It's incredibly intelligent, but it's also completely unrelatable. And it gives that's where you end up with things of dubious quality, like the standard model of cosmology, whose very existence hinges on some fanciful concept like dark matter. To me, if your scientific model is only 20% testable, you need another model. We know that dark matter exists, even though it is completely unreactive to all forms of electromagnetic radiation. Why? Well, because that's the way gravity works. And so maybe if 4/5 of your entire universe is totally undetectable and can't be detected out of gravitational fields, what's more likely, that is the case, or that you're doing gravity wrong?
I have a couple of comments.
By the same by the same token, if you're, well, cosmologists, basically what they're doing, they're making up a story, but they're doing it so totally in their heads and so theoretically that they have no idea how bad of a job they're doing.
It's hard to relate to.
Which is exactly what Butler says, that he wrote 1,000,000 words of Drek because he didn't realize how bad of a job he was doing. And so what makes an artist an artist is engaging the world in the most relatable way possible through feelings, both sensory and emotional. An artist is a synesthete by desire and by practice.
Well, what's interesting is
go ahead.
Go ahead, James. No, I'm jumping the queue here.
I was just going to say that, like, with regard to what he says about the theologians and the psychoanalysts and the philosophers, like, I guess that applies unless you're Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo or Raphael, who all used their scientific knowledge and analytical ability to not only dabble, but to become professionals in all of those areas, as well as use those skills to inform their art. I am not a Leonardo da Vinci. I think that Renaissance people come around once, twice, maybe 3 times in a lifetime, but they are there. They do exist. And I think ignoring them is a little fallacious. Additionally, when he says all of those things about sensory, and I wrote a little piece here. When he's talking about being a sensorate, it's like, everyone's a sensorate because that's literally the exclusive way that we are able to interact with the stimulus, the outside world, our senses. That's it. That's all we have. It's not the primary way. It's the only way. And so it's kind of a long-winded way of saying to the writer, use sense words. So effective writing doesn't say it was winter. Effective writing says, deafened by the natural acoustics provided by the season, I listened and watched my breath coil thin spindles into the sky, trudging my way up the drive, feet crunching with every step. It's just a different way, a more sensorate way of saying it's winter, but everyone understands it. It's unified by the senses because everyone can, well, with exclusions, I don't want to say everyone, but most human beings.
Everyone, that's not all, everybody. People should understand that doesn't necessarily mean literally.
Right.
Generally speaking.
Say that.
And so I think that is absolutely excellent advice. It's also creative writing 101 advice. You write your senses. It's not like, it's not some huge revelation. It is important. It is essential. It is due the weight that Butler ascribes it. But it's pretty basic stuff.
But that's kind of how I feel about a lot of the stuff he says, where it's like,
I'm losing. Sorry to interrupt. I'm losing the stream here, I think, guys. Is anybody else breaking up?
No.
Nope.
Are you? That's interesting.
I can.
Are we breaking up?
I didn't. I barely got anything that big James just
Maybe
said.
you should come in and out and
log out and then come back in. And you may even reset your browser. Step out, reset your browser, and then come back.
That usually fixes it.
I can wait for him.
I'll add you back to the stream.
I was going to add one thing too to the idea of sensory writing. It dawned on me one time that I was like, thinking is pretty important, especially depending. Like I have a third person limited, and I call it interiority, where you're describing what they're like, how they are on the inside. That's not sensory, but it's vital to it's.
That's a good point.
We experience the world through an interiority of thought and analysis. How many times we get caught up, analyze, like, am I speaking too much? Am I doing like that's not sensory, but it's vital to a way to connect your character because that's how our minds work.
That is a really good point.
It is.
Both of those things.
Yeah.
Am I back? Can I be heard?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Hear us?
Yeah, the stream is much smoother now.
Okay, good. That fixed it.
Zinger.
Was that what you were going to say? Sorry.
Who was saying something about the way the brain works?
We're talking.
That's my belly weight.
I was just saying that there's another rail or another tier there to sensory. I was always I was taught to always write from the senses, and I do a lot of that. But it dawned on me that a vital thing in writing, especially if you're writing a character, is interiority. What they're thinking, what they think is going on, this analysis of the outside world from within that they're going. I call it interiority, but that's not a sense. It's a way of experiencing the world that's not sensory.
I think it's likely influenced and established by sense, but I think that.
But it's
you're
unique,
right?
right?
I think it's not a sense. Yeah, it's not.
That goes into the 5 types of the ways emotions are experienced that he actually mentions in the first chapter, though. Sensual reactions inside the body, number 1. 2, sensual response sending external signals, that is expression, posture, tones of voice, all that kind of stuff. 3, sense impression flashbacks. 4, flashes of the future or daydreams. And then 5 is central selectivity, which means focus on, like, we're constantly bombarded with millions of inputs all at once, so it's focusing on one particular thing at a time. So exactly what you were saying is he lists through is like the sensual experience that you're imparting through fiction is something that is, he makes a point, unique to literature, to the written word, is that you can impart that internal sensory experience to the reader.
Well,
which
I just
no
think,
other.
Yeah, the only reason I wanted to distinguish it is because I feel like 95, maybe 99% of people, when they hear sensory, they're thinking sight, smell, touch, hearing. Mm-hmm. So I always wanted to make a distinction that interiority is a very specific form of, I almost hesitate to call it sensing.
Mental processing.
Yeah,
experience. It's part of
there's some authors that are really good at that.
This actually, here's where my life experience comes in. Maybe this is one of the reasons the book resonated so heavily with me in the first place. Is I've worked a lot in my mom is a natural health practitioner and herbalist and other forms of non medical health support, and I've done plenty of work in that field myself and worked with numerous people, including things like counseling and emotional trauma release. And people do this kind of mental categorization and justification and abstraction constantly to try and describe what it is they're actually feeling. And in practice, when you're helping people get into trauma release and access, because the only way to actually release the trauma is to, okay, let me backtrack a little bit. When people get caught up in things like anxiety and what have you, then the reason that the anxiety keeps coming up in particular situations is because whatever emotion you're experiencing during the trauma was short-circuited, and you stopped the expression of the emotion partway through. But that energy, that feeling, that sensation still is there and has to go through, and something has to be done with it. And so if you don't allow it to be expressed, you then it will start coming back up.
You have to kind of rechannel it.
Kind of. And so you want to actually, this is where you go into the idea of going into the white hot center. And Butler says, hey, I don't want to do that. You're thinking, I don't want to do that. I've spent my life, I wake up screaming at night. I spent my life keeping well out of there. Most people do. You'll get somebody to modulate their breathing, start going into their sensations, and you have to direct them, okay, what are you feeling inside your body? Oh, well, I'm feeling it always starts out abstraction. Yeah, I'm feeling dread, or I'm feeling like I'm not good enough. Like, okay, that is summarization, that is justification, that is not what you're feeling. That's what you are categorizing the way you're feeling as. And then it's like, okay, where in your body are you feeling that feeling? And what is the temperature of it? And what is its size and shape and color and all this kind of stuff? And you start engaging people on that sensory level. And then they actually get into the emotion, and then they can actually move through the problems. And the process of writing fiction that he's talking about in this book is that same thing.
Well, and I agree. Like I said, his description. His description of the process I thought was extremely accurate and valuable. But prescriptive, I would hesitate, because every writer is different.
Right.
Real quick, Can I address this dubious claim in the chat?
What's
that? Brianna invented ice cream.
This is an inside joke. Is this Sky? Are you Sky right there? Just want to make sure, because
no, I don't think. I understand. No, I don't think Stray is Sky.
No, he's not.
That would shock. No, wait a minute. That would be shocking if
it is Sky, then it's an inside joke. But I was like,
Brianna, will you go on the record? Did you or did you not invent ice cream?
I don't. If that is not the joke, I'm completely confused what the joke is.
Yeah, Stray. Can you? Where did this come from?
I thought it was because you were so cool.
Oh, if this is Sky.
No. There's like that would Stray has been with us for a year.
Oh, that's
like,
so
first
funny.
of all, that would
never mind.
Confuse my world if Stray over his entire year had been Sky.
I was like, wait a second, because I didn't think so either.
Is Sky like a mutual friend or something?
No, you played Sky, the Leon Sky, who you played.
Oh, yeah, okay.
He and I had a running joke that had to do with mint ice cream.
Okay, but you're right. That was the idea. Yes, because Brianna's so cool, she invented ice cream.
What?
But now Stray says, "I want to be Sky." Now.
You guys both give off similar vibes. Like I would imagine his profile picture would look like yours, so that's why I was like, cool.
So she didn't invent ice cream.
No.
She was close to it though.
I'm glad I understand the joke now.
Holding forth a little more, if you guys don't mind indulging me on that same vein.
No, go for it.
This actually ties into one of the biggest points, because that entire third section of the War of Art talks about
ice cream. I must not have gotten there.
Yes, absolutely, 100% ice cream. No, it talks about going essentially the metaphysical side of creation. Of creating art, and it talks about how you've got the ego, which is concrete and temporally bound and focuses on survival and all this kind of stuff, and it's where he says it's where resistance comes from. And then you have the self, the Jungian sense of self, which is that greater part of you that exists in the physical body, which is where the sensorium interacts with the material plane, right? And his whole point is you have to step out of the ego and get into the self to get out of resistance and be creative. And it's the same idea as going into the White Hot Center. And I had a whole thing. That's where really the two books kind of came together for me, as like they're both saying the same thing essentially. The ego is displayed. So there's a graphic, an illustration in the War of Art, the only one, where the ego is displayed as a little dot in a large sea of the self, and then the self is set on like this.
Can I find it?
Yeah, it's on page 132, where or 133 or whatever it is.
I'll try to find it.
And then there's the divine ground, because he. Pressfield's very spiritual about this. He believes that we as beings, the stuff of the soul that makes us up comes from something greater, and so the divine ground is where the self comes from, and then the ego is he doesn't say. Okay, here's where we get into what I drew from this. The ego is displayed as a little dot in a large sea of the self. So you think of the ego as the point of a pencil. And it's what allows us to make our mark.
You said what page? You said what page?
133, I believe.
From Where You Dream?
No, this is in War of Art.
Okay, because I didn't see it. I'm okay. Now I feel.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I'm describing what is in here. So the ego is a little dot on a large sea of the self. So it's the point of a pencil that allows us to make a mark on our surroundings while it moves through this temporal and physical reality. And it is also our interface with that reality, i.e. the sensorium. But the signals from the sensorium are not our personality. They are the triggers to which our personality responds. If you want to elicit a response, which is the purpose of art, then you must hit these triggers. If you wish to create something great, something enduring, then you hit those triggers by a genuine expression of the things that activate your own triggers.
Yes.
Despite the fact that we feel as though our ego is us and the self is our so-called internal life, that's merely an artifact of the outward-facing sensorium being constantly impinged upon by outside signals. In reality, the ego divides us from the self. It's like a little tube-like fish tank that interfaces with the physical. It keeps us focused on the small things, the point of the pencil. We have to find a way to turn that roar of input into background noise. Again, going back to things like mantras, transcendental meditation that Robert Olen Butler talked about earlier, or dervishes, which is what Pressfield mentions, or the athlete entering flow state or the zone. We use these to lower the volume of the sensorium so we can listen to what's going on outside of the ego and step into the experience of the real person, i.e. the self. That's Butler's white hot center. You have to actually walk up to the boundary of the ego. It's this pillar of fire that surrounds you. And that's where it interfaces with and divides us from the self. And then you plunge your hand through that fire and you grab yourself a big old double handful of the magma on the other side, no matter how much it burns. And then you root around in all that molten slag until you hit something that makes you sit up and say, hey, this is important. And then you pull that back through the wall of fire and you start working it over and molding it and shaping it so until you feel it's the best form that's going to impart its nature to anyone else who then interacts with it later on. That's what Butler calls the art object. Sometimes you'll start losing focus on what is evocative, and the sculpture starts to cool and harden so that you have to take it back and shove it through that blast furnace barrier again and get it all nice and soft. So get the ego kind of nice and soft so you can start making it hot and workable again. Then maybe grab another hunk or two and you shove it in the lava so that you're feeling something that's missing, or maybe you had too much and so you burn off part of it that was tripping you up. And then you do that over and over and over and over again until you have an object that will most closely approximate the emotional response that you want to share, that you want other people to experience when they interact with it. I think it was Michelangelo, going back to what Bacon said, who said something to the effect that every block of stone has a statue inside it, and it's the task of the sculptor to set it free. And that's what both Butler and Pressfield are actually talking about at the core of their books. Each one is describing the same thing in their own words and in their own ways.
And I think that is descriptive and very valuable to read and to kind of visualize. He's giving you a visual of what's happening in that synthesis process inside the psyche. And I think that's good. It's connecting you to that place in your mind rather than the external structure, the external information that you're bringing in. He's, again, getting you back into that stream that, where it all comes out of to find something valuable. I would even say to some extent, like Brianna, you were talking about hyper focus. And to me, when you're in a hyper focus state, that's close to being in the zone because you're shedding all these other
it's being
things.
in the zone. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
That's what it is.
But the ego doesn't have any room in there when you're hyper focused. So your ego tends to slide off.
Person, yes.
Right.
Was this that I was trying hard?
That's the one. That's the one. Yep.
Diagram.
That's it.
So explain the importance of this diagram, will you? I'm sorry again. I put it up on the screen now. Will you please?
Yeah, the ego there. That's that dot's that pencil point. And the whole reason the ego exists is so that our larger self that exists outside of it can interface with the physical world. It's the only way we can interface with the physical world. But that person, that so-called internal life, that responds emotionally to all the sense data that we get, that's the real person there. And so, yeah, we have to have the pencil point because otherwise we don't get anything done. But when you're making art, you've got to, it's like, imagine yourself in the middle of that little ego dot, and all around you is this big white hot wall of flame that is the dividing line between everything you're experiencing here in this little chunk of time and space that you're in, and all the real stuff that is you and your experiences and the things that you have to say about it. And like that was just me writing down notes that I wrote stream of consciousness about. You go and stick your hands into the forge and pull out the magma of your experiences and make it into something that will impart an experience to someone else.
Can I? That feel like that segues into basically the last kind of thing that I have in my notes.
Go for it.
That was awesome, Sable.
If you guys will bear with me for a brief little monologue.
Please.
No, I'm apologizing.
Good. I've done like 5.
And I'm gonna it's gonna sound like I'm going back in the conversation, but then I'm gonna bring it around to stuff that's
It's like a slingshot. You go back to shoot forward.
Yeah. So since this touches on something that Doug had talked about earlier, with kind of having this like the core that you're working with, and then kind of having the technique on the outside. I can't remember exactly how you worded it, but it's abstract concept here. So part of my, Heath mentioned, he said he considers himself a craftsman. I'm someone that I would consider myself equally both. I would say I'm equally an artist and equally a craftsman. I relate to both of those art. Maybe it's 40-60. I might be 60% a craftsman, something like that. It's very even for me. And part of the reason why that is because of my background and my training is in graphic design. And one of the things that
Oh, mine too.
Oh yeah, really?
Visual.
Well, 3D computer animation, but similar.
Oh, okay, yeah. With graphic design specifically, one of the things that in my schooling experience that was very clearly hounded into us is that you are not artists. They would say that phrase. They would use the word, you are not artist. And in fact, if you think of yourself as an artist, you will trip yourself up and you will not be able to work professionally, because what you are is you're a craftsman. What you are is you are creating things that have a practical purpose, right? So you are like, it's the equivalent of making a chair that people are going to sit on.
And you have to execute requests, which is
exactly. Someone has a need and you are going to meet it. And if you get all like emotionally involved and like, this is my baby, like you're not going to be able to work professionally.
I was a desktop publisher for 5 years. It's graphic design was a part of the job. So I
I'm
very well familiar with all this. Yeah. You can't let your ego get in the way. If you show someone something that they didn't want or don't like, it's like, okay, I'll change it. You can't. You're not an artist. You can't let your emotion get in the way. It is 100% a product.
But in my experience, they didn't say this to me in school, but what I have experienced, almost whatever it's been, 8 years since I graduated.
That'll make other people feel old here.
What?
That'll make other people feel old here. When you're like, gee, it's been 8 years since I graduated college.
Oh my God. Sorry. But in my experience, it is both. With graphic design specifically, there is still a white hot center I have to pull from, or else I can't create it all. If I am drained, if I'm burnt out, I can't do graphic design. It's been very annoying. I've had times where I was doing it full time. I don't do it full time now, but I would be like, on Fridays, I would have the hardest time designing things. And I would always push things to Monday. And then all of a sudden on Monday, it was easy. I was like, oh, I can do this in 15 minutes. But I'd be like staring at something for an hour being like, I don't know where to put the items. I know I have all these techniques. I have all this.
You're resistant. Yeah.
But it's like, I can't do it because I'm physically exhausted. And I find that there's still always a little tiny, even though I've trained myself not to, let this get in the way. Practically, there's still a little part of me every time I make something, I give it to someone, a little part of me is like, I hope they like it. Because there is a little part of you that's still creative. And so in my experience, this is not for everyone. In my experience, I find that the process for all creative things, for storytelling too, it's always like there's that, like I love that phrase, the white hot center, where there's this thing that sort of brings out the raw material to work with. It's like bringing out the raw, stone that I'm going to use to hew out a statue. But then
you're not a robot,
right? It's it's craftsmanship that then will allow me to do that. And one of the things that again makes it so hybridized in my mind is like I think about something like James was talking about, art as having, excellence. You could say something like, okay, let's say we make this distinction like they would make in my school experience. You'd be like, over here, we have a painting. And this is art. It's just this expression. It's art. And then over here, I have a chair and it has this practical purpose. But the art can also have a purpose. It could be decoration in a room. It's like, it obviously will have like a soul and emotional purpose, but like you will choose a painting that specifically, fits in a specific environment, has the right colors and things like that. That's graphic design thinking, right? And also the art that you want, even if it's abstract modern art that just like shapes on a wall, it still is going to use craftsmanship usually if it resonates with people. And so I find it so difficult to make these separate. But it also has to do with stages for me personally. Like if I have done this before where I had a story idea and I tried to bring in, like I was still in that white hot stage of like, this is beginning to emerge. And I tried to bring in the analytical side too soon and I killed it and it destroyed it. And I couldn't bring it back. Like it was like the stone wasn't big enough for me to sculpt with. And then it just crumbled and then I couldn't recreate it. I've learned that lesson. I have not done that again. So
that is the worst.
Yes.
There's nothing worse than feeling like you've lost something valuable there.
Although the pieces of that particular one I was able to recycle them a little bit, but the original thing itself was gone. So anyway, so kind of bringing this back, something that is very mysterious and fascinating to me about that process, about that, like, you know, the intuitive side, the whatever that mystery is that we're referring to of where creativity comes from. Here I'll get a little more kooky and see
kooky is good.
What you think about. I have a friend that I talk about stuff like this for. We'll talk for hours about this kind of stuff. But there's Huh?
Does his first name begin with Heath? I'm kidding.
No, this is a different friend. A different friend I met on the internet, actually. But there is a connection that I perceive between, this is why I wanted to read the book, dreams, the experience of dreaming, the experience of creating, and also spiritual experiences. Like, and I, full disclosure, I'm personally, like, I'm an atheist and I don't believe in anything supernatural. So I don't mean spiritual supernaturally, but it can be if that's what how someone thinks of it. I'm talking about the same phenomenon, however you interpret that. But like, spiritual, like, for example, for me, that'd be like things that I experience when I'm in altered mind states, meditation. There's definitely, I'm sure, I mean, I know people have studied this kind of stuff, but I want them to study it more and get more, you know, measure people's brains. Cause it's like, there's something mysterious there that I'm so fascinated by, that like, there's something happening there that's similar. And it's so, it's like and it's like, for me, the more I am connected, like on a spiritual level, like with my intuitive self and all those kinds of things, it's like my dreams changed. I was hyperfixating this past couple of weeks. I was dreaming about the story I was working on. It's very annoying. And I don't know, it's hard to put it into words, but it's like those three things feel like they're connected. Do you guys relate to that? Do you not?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. The whole, you didn't throw me under the bus, by the way, Bacon. Sorry, James, your name's
no, Bacon's fine. Everyone calls me Bacon. That's totally fine.
The thing that he mentioned, where I was like, it wasn't necessarily from where you dream specifically that started it. I literally had a story come to a couple characters and various situations come to me in a dream. That's what I'm starting to write. And that comes up for artists all the time. J. Michael Straczynski created Babylon 5. He says the entire 5-year arc came to him in the shower. And he jumped out of the shower, threw on a towel, and went dripping to his typewriter and wrote it all down. This happens all the time, right? Mm-hmm. Because, like Brianna's saying, I 100% agree with you. There's something spiritual. Not talking supernatural necessarily, but that person, that self that exists around that pencil point of the ego, that's where all that comes from. Sometimes it's just bam, right there.
I have an opinion on this.
I think it's the closest thing to, like, so I'm writing The Heroine's Labyrinth, which is about recurrent archetypal designs that
you handed that final draft in.
What's that?
I said you handed that final draft in. You're done.
That's right.
That's right. Yeah. Right. Wrote.
Oh, God,
wrote it.
We're gonna have a party. By the way, I'm gonna make sure to get a signed copy from the dog.
Oh man, I'll be happy to. I mean, honestly, Heath and his whole channel, everyone, it's been such a big part of it, and you're all in the acknowledgments. I really can't be appreciative enough. But just to segue back into this conversation, Brianna was bringing up the idea of something more without assigning supernaturalness to it.
Unless you want to.
What's that?
I said, unless you do. I'm not trying to
but there's a value in kind of cordoning off that and saying, well, if it's not supernatural, then what is it? You know, there's something here that resonates. And I always found it to be the closest thing to psychicness. If the writer of the Epic of Gilgamesh did something super similar to, the Iliad, Homer, what the heck just happened? How are these unrelated creative people coming up with comparable archetypal designs from inside their psyches? So to me, there is something there. And I feel like that the human psyche is the key to it. When I'm writing a story, there are times where I sense that this is going to connect with somebody, and it came out of nowhere. I'm trying to use words to describe it, but it came from somewhere, and I'm doing my best to explain it or to describe it. And then someone else, like the whole thing in the Heroine's Labyrinth, patterns that I found, these were from writers that never communicated with each other. These patterns were there, and there's similar patterns. I think that's fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Anyway,
I have something to say about this. Like, I'm from the. I'm sorry. Did I step on someone?
I was just about to read a couple of paragraphs from the War of Art that are exactly what's talking about here.
Let's let James talk first.
Oh yeah,
James. I've got a paragraph from the War of Art to read too. So let's go, James.
Oh, nice.
Here's what I have to say about this. I am an IT professional. Specifically, I'm a tester. If I want to know how a system works, the last person I'm going to ask is the end user. The first person I'm going to ask is the developer. The second person I'm going to ask is the business analyst. The third person I would ask is the tester. Okay. I don't have access to the developer of the human creative mind. The testers and the business analysts are all out to lunch. They have no idea where creative ideas come from. So all I have to go on is the end user's opinion. And because they're end users and they all use the system in different ways and they all experience different inputs and different outputs, I have no choice but to believe everyone. So when Pressfield says that it's a spiritual external experience and that muses and angels come to him and impart to him the knowledge of God, of his true self, so that he can be the writer that he knows he is, which is the difference between how he is today and the resistant one he was yesterday, or resisted one he was yesterday, I have to believe that that's where creativity comes from. Likewise, when Olen Butler says that it is a white-hot internal core of the self that you access in order to be creative, I also have to believe that, because until the BAs, the testers, and the devs can tell me where the hell it comes from with definition, I have no idea. And so I think that there's validity to each and every one of these approaches. And I think that, and this kind of goes back to the idea of us becoming sort of singularities of this knowledge, because I think that all of these are tributaries to how we in turn are creative. So I agree with you, but I have to, because I don't have any other way to understand it. You know what I mean?
That's like totally fair too.
That was the geekiest metaphor I think I've ever heard. That was fantastic.
It's the what?
Awesome.
Yeah, I've never heard it like that.
Thank you.
That's awesome, James. That's fantastic.
Thank you. And then you guys wanted to read something out.
You go ahead, Sable, then I'll pick up.
Okay. This backtracks a little bit. It's going to sort of reiterate what you just said, James. As a response to what you had just said before him, Doug. What page is this? There's the page 115 in War of Art. The universe the Greeks believed was not indifferent. The gods take an interest in human affairs and intercede for good or ill in our designs. The contemporary view is that all this is charming but preposterous. Is it? Then answer this. Where did Hamlet come from? Where did the Parthenon come from? Where did nude descending a staircase come from?
I love it.
And it's like he just leaves it on his question, but it's exactly what you guys are talking about.
I know, it's amazing. And then you have like the Sistine Chapel, like all these things that people have created, and it's just amazing.
Where did the Ninth Symphony come from?
It's always weird when you feel that yourself, where you're like, it feels like it does. It's like, I feel like personally, sometimes it's like the White House Center. Sometimes it is like a muse. I talk about the muse because it's like, I don't know where that came from. You're like, that doesn't even sound like my writing. I don't write that well. Where'd that come from?
Yeah.
So
100%.
Faraway Bird, I had published under my own company, and I call it Silent Music Press. And the reason I called it that is because all the greatest music ever written comes first from the silence. Like that entire symphony started in complete silence. And I always remind myself of that because it's so bizarre that something that powerful and that loud and that visceral came from the most silent place in the world. This like gray matter inside. It's just amazing to me. And that's all art comes from this place. It's bizarre.
Pressfield describes that as the muses being their own discrete beings, and they go and they whisper that symphony to this person and the next person and the next person until somebody listens. And that one person who listens is the artist who creates that
we're
that work
good
of art.
if you're listening.
There's something humbling about that kind of a metaphor because it takes you away from, even though I don't technically think that's how it works, but it's experientially
Right.
it is. And I like thinking about it that way because it takes away from the like, I'm this brilliant, writer,
Totally.
I'm this prodigy artist. Instead, it's like this thing came to me and then I actually responded to it. I happened to be the one that decided to
Merely
respond.
a conduit.
You know what's
Yeah,
weird is like
That's
my wife has told me like when she was reading Faraway Bird, she's like, you wrote this? She's like, I don't hear you in here at all. She knows my personality. Like I'm such a weird guy. So it's just funny how like when you are hyper
you're
focused,
channeling.
that ego does it drifts off and you're somewhere else and this stuff comes from some other place. That's weird.
And
And
I'd
actually-
like to just bring up briefly that in two of the examples that both Sable Phoenix and Doug brought up, so the music and architecture, the Parthenon, intensely mathematical processes.
Totally.
Intensely
That's true.
mathematical.
True.
Well, you know what's interesting too is I was talking to a mathematician from the University of Texas. One of our mutual friends started dating this guy, and it was really weird because what do you say to a high-level mathematician? Like you can't. It's hard for me to relate. I didn't know how to bring up like, hey, I took a math class once. Like how do you get an inroad to that conversation? So anyway, it was just weird. I was telling him how, as a writer, I go, what's weird is I hated math. I go, I hate math. And I was resistant to it. I go, but the further down the road I got to the creative process, the more I realized I needed some math, the processes, the structure. I really needed to build the machine to like funnel that creativity through it. So I told him, I go, there's a lot of math to writing, even into sentence structure. And he's like, well, what's really weird? He goes, in high level mathematics, it becomes more creative. And he was telling me how it becomes a creative process, how it's not so linear. And so I was like, really? So again, even in these, what I view as opposite poles of the human mind, they end up like intersecting, which is amazing.
This is why calling it the left brain and right brain, it's better to say left brain and left hemisphere and right hemisphere, because it's like a better way to realize that like these are not two separate, these two separate brains. They're two parts of a whole.
Yeah.
Yes.
And to get to your point, Doug, any high level problem solving is always a creative endeavor. You might not think that computer programming is creative, but it is 100% creatively solving with a specific tool set for a problem that's in front of you.
See,
Testing,
I love
go
that.
ahead. No. And it's every high level problem solving job. So I'm, like I said, I'm a tester. My problem to solve is the stability of the code that's delivered. And I have to be very creative in the ways that I use the system to try and get it to break.
Interesting. That's so
it's
interesting.
all very, very creative. And it's something that you don't necessarily think is creative.
Well,
I
am now.
Like
I'm starting to appreciate that.
That actually ties into, it's funny how, as you're saying that, I'm looking at one of my pages of notes here. And I was struck by something that I wrote down here that ties into what you were just saying, where Butler, Robert Olen Butler here is talking all about process, right? And he puts process first, get the process before then once you've learned the craft, you can hone that process into an expression, right? Regardless of that I think that what you're describing is what we typically mean when we say talent. What is talent? It's like, oh, talent's like pornography. I know it when I see it. But what talent actually is, what I believe talent is, connecting to the War of Art and From Where You Dream both, it's people who have an innate grasp of the process of their art before they learn the related craft and study the craft. So it's people, the really good ones are the ones we call savants or prodigies or whatever, like Mozart. Inherent grasp of music when he was born.
But I read a book. Listen, there's a great book called Talent is Overrated, and Mozart was one of the examples. Tiger Woods, Michael Jordan. They say these guys all had something in common, and it wasn't this strange predilection toward any massive amounts of practice.
Of course, they practiced.
Yeah. I am a firm believer in the flexible nature of the human condition. If you want to get better at anything, practice.
Of course.
If you want to get smarter, practice. If you want to become a better athlete, practice. And so I don't necessarily subscribe wholly to the idea of an innate talent. I think that if you want to be a writer and if you are just absolutely abysmal, you can write more and read more. And that's something that's funny because it's something that neither Pressfield nor Olen Butler mentioned. They never mentioned reading.
Hey, Retro.
To be a good writer. Hey, RNG, what's up?
No, but Butler absolutely mentions reading a lot to become he says you read voraciously. He says it has to go into the compost.
When we were kids, though, we've all run into someone who was good at something.
Yeah,
100%. I'm not saying that all great artists are inherently talented. That's not true. In fact, one of my best animation teachers in art college, he was a self-proclaimed non-artist. He says, I can't draw a lick. As he's sitting there doing incredible stuff, right? And he says, the whole reason that I was able to work as an animator at Disney is because I worked my ass off.
Right.
He just practiced incessantly.
Well, even the way
and there are absolutely people who have a whole bunch of natural inclination towards a particular form of creative expression that never pursue it into any form that's going to create actual works that other people can experience.
Well, I find it fascinating how he worded it, that I can't draw a lick. He still sees himself as an outsider who
100%.
I love that.
That's so here's what I would say is that I think talent exists, but it's a slight there's a couple steps. It just saves you a couple steps. In other words, so if someone has talent, they might have an inclination towards something.
It's a person who can see that.
They still have to they still have to go and learn and practice, but they might.
Yeah,
someone who doesn't have that talent just has to do it a little bit more. But you can. Person who's talented who doesn't do anything will never measure up to the person who doesn't have talent but works their ass off.
Yes. And that's 100% agree. That's not. I wasn't trying to exclude that in the definition. It's just that the person who has talent can see the structure behind the craft without knowing the craft.
Well, I'm going to add a nuance there.
Somebody who doesn't have that talent can still learn the craft and make incredible art.
Mm-hmm.
So I think talent is like a clue, like that you should pursue this. That this is something you should learn, because
Pressfield talks about that too.
Well, but we all know people like this too. That talent can be a trap. I've seen people that have great talent and therefore they were here early. And so they fail to develop themselves, and then we pass them up.
Yes, that happens.
And this happens in all. I remember even when I used to run track, and I'm a small guy. I did not look very athletic, but I started beating guys that looked like physical specimen, and I would almost resent them because I'm like, how did you let me beat you? Like you have no excuse. So sometimes when you have an early edge, it can cause you to shut down because you think you're so good. Yeah. So I do think that even people who didn't have the talent can become better. It's really all about the individual. What does that person do with the talent?
Hard work, dedication, that measures more. Like talent exists and it can help and it can be helpful, but it's not anywhere near as helpful. It's not the thing that gets you there.
You should read the book. It's called Talent is Overrated. Really good book.
Talent is overrated. I want to take a note of that.
Because it also gives you hope that if you really want to be good at something, then you make up your mind and you go for it. You don't rely on this idea that you have any special talent, that you're all that goes out the window, and it comes down to you honing your craft, and it cuts through to the most important thing.
I am a very firm, staunch believer in that position. I think that the human condition is extremely flexible. If you want to do something, then you put in the work and you can do it. But I mean, there's biological evidence of the flexibility of the human condition. There are infants that are born with fetal alcohol syndrome that only have a brainstem, that are able to develop as a fully functioning human being because the brain is able to rewire itself within the stem. And so even that, as a very basic sort of example of just how flexible humans are. Now, you might not be starting off in life on the same foot as Leonardo da Vinci is. He may be able to achieve a higher high than you, but if he doesn't go anywhere, if he peaks early, if he doesn't invest in his talents 100%, you'll be able to pass him. And I think that that's worth noting. And I think that that's more worthy of notation than talent or some sort of nebulous creativity that you can tap into. Not that I'm invalidating it at all. I just think that it's very worthy of an inclusion in the conversation.
Well, exactly, because talent is esoteric and ethereal. Hard work, practice is accessible.
Yes.
And I think that that's the key, because even when I was reading it, I was like, it isn't. It shatters all the illusions, and it's suddenly like, okay, so it comes down to you working.
That's what Pressfield says too.
Here's the
You do the work.
Okay. See, that's what Stephen Pressfield talks about. Okay, this is a perfect segue. I was trying to come up with a place to put this in, because I was trying to come up with that. I was generally had a negative opinion from Where You Dream and this approach, but I'm very pro War of Art. Like I said, if I start a religion, that'd be a religious text.
It's a very spiritual book.
I'm very pro that. But yet I completely understand what Sable was saying, that we've got parallels. And I also saw those. I was like, we got parallels here. So what is it that causes one of these things to feel very negative, for me to feel very negative about, and the other one to feel extremely positive about?
Probably the author.
Well, it could be the author. But,
it's accessibility.
One of the things is that I didn't feel when I was reading The War of Art that I was being told how to do it. I was being told what you need to do, but I wasn't being told how it was going to happen. That Stephen Pressfield is very open on how something is going to happen when you sit down. He is very pro. You've got to sit down every day. You've got to work that creative. The War of Art. You're going to be going to war every day trying to get your art done. But as far as I know, and I read the book years ago, and I reread about the first half of the book before I sat down to read this. So I can't. Maybe there's something in the other half of the book that I missed, but he doesn't talk about how you're supposed to do it, which Butler does. So, for example, here is the opening of The War of Art. Okay, what I do. So there are three sections of this. This is what I do. He says, I get up, I take a shower, have breakfast, read the paper, brush my teeth. If I have phone calls to make, I make them. I've got my coffee now. I put on my lucky work boots and stitch up the lucky laces that my niece Meredith gave me. I head back to the office, crank up the computer. My lucky hooded sweatshirt is draped over the chair with my lucky charm I got from a gypsy in Santis Maries de Mer for only $8 in francs. And then my lucky Largo name tag that came from a dream I once had. I put it on. On my thesaurus is my lucky cannon that my friend Bob Verisindi gave me from Morano Castle, Cuba. I point it toward my chair so it can fire inspiration into me. I say a prayer, which is the invocation of the muse from Homer's Odyssey, translation by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, which my dear mate Paul Rink gave me and which sits near my shelf with the cufflinks that belong to my father and my lucky acorn from the Battle of Thermopylae. It's 10:30 now. I sit down and plunge in. When I start making typos, I know I'm getting tired. That's 4 hours or so. I've hit the point of diminishing returns. I wrap up for the day, copy whatever I've done to disk, and stash the disc in my glove compartment in my truck in case there's a fire and I have to run for it. I power down. That's 3:30. The office is closed. How many pages have I produced? I don't care. Are they any good? I don't even think about it. All that matters is that I put my time in and I've hit it with all I've got. All that counts now for this day, for this session, is that I have overcome resistance. I love that.
I love it. And there's a particular turning point in it that I think is so effective and crucial. I've got my coffee now. It goes from, here's why, because it goes from a description to an action. He's describing how he does things, and then suddenly in a sentence, he's there in the moment and you can see him doing it. And I think that's such an effect. It's a non sequitur, obviously. That's not the material that we should be discussing, but I find that it's such an effective, just a teeny little sentence. I've got my coffee now that's restructured differently to everything that came before that really puts you in the moment.
Yeah. And then he's telling you what he does. He doesn't, because then later, even in interviews that I've seen with him, man, it would be fantastic if Stephen Pressfield would come on the show.
Yeah.
That would.
But you know, even with Stephen Pressfield, like people will talk to him about what he does while he's actually writing, and he'll talk to you about it, because I've seen interviews where people are like, "Do you listen to music?" And he's like, "Well, no, I don't." He's like, "But you can if you want to." Like, he's completely not like, was it prescriptive or descriptive? I forget, about what you should be doing during this time. He's completely not about that. Like, if you want to talk to him about what he personally does, then he'll talk to you, you know, he'll say, well, what I personally do is this, but that may have no influence on you whatsoever. You know, if you're just interested in me, okay, you know, I'll tell you, but he doesn't go into it. The next chapter, like we might need to read this on the morning grind, because each chapter is like a page. Like, that's a chapter right there. In
you could do a chapter at the top of the show every day for 89 days, something like that.
Maybe we should do that. I would say the rear. Maybe we should do the top of the show. Maybe we should do the top of the show, because like the next page is this, and this is how I would replace sin. Instead of sin and religion, it would be resistance, because he says, what I know, there's a secret that real writers know that wannabe writers don't, and the secret is this: it's not the writing parts that hard. It is hard. It's the sitting down to write. It's the sitting down to write. That's what keeps us from, what keeps us from sitting down is resistance. So instead of sin, if I were to create this as a religion,
you thought about this a lot.
What you are fighting against is resistance. Everything. Because he says over here,
defend your time. Yeah.
He says over here, most of us have two lives: the lives we live and the unlived life within us. Between the two stands resistance. Have you ever brought home a treadmill and let it gather dust in the attic? Ever quit a diet, a course of yoga, a meditation practice? Have you ever bailed out on a call to embark upon a spiritual practice? Dedicate yourself to a humanitarian calling. Commit your life to the service of others. Have you ever wanted to be a mother, a doctor, an advocate for the weak and the helpless, to run for office, crusade for the planet, campaign for world peace, or preserve the environment? Late at night, you have experienced a vision of the person you might become, the work that you could accomplish, the realized being that you are meant to be. Are you a writer who doesn't write, a painter who does not paint, an entrepreneur who never starts a venture? Then you know what resistance is.
The difference
that would be the core of my religion right there.
Yeah, that particular explanation kind of really resonated with me, about resistance being the difference between who you are and who you're meant to be.
Well, it sounds like the approach vector from the two authors is completely different.
Oh, absolutely opposite. Absolutely opposite. One's external, one's internal.
But it sounds like one guy starts from an expansive position, the other guy's a little bit more walled off. I think that seems to be one of the things I'm picking up.
But so why are we drawing because I realize not everybody has read both books, but like when Sable was like, I see parallels with the War of Art, I was like, I agree, because both I agree that Stephen Pressfield is also like, you know what I have to do every day. I have to go into the office, I turn everything off, I turn my computer on, and then I go to war with writing a book for 4 hours.
You know what it is? I have a theory. You can relate to Pressfield. You cannot relate to Robert Olen Butler as easily. He's coming. Remember, I was like, he's the professor and you're the student.
Yeah.
He's out there. he's bestowing this information. So maybe there's a problem with relating to the information where it sounds like Brianna especially and James were very okay. Enough. There was a certain, and I'm saying this like
accurate impression.
No, you're right.
There's a certain standoffishness or off-putting nature that really triggered a couple of the readers. And I said earlier, what a shame, because there is an important core here. But it sounds like
I was still able to hear the important core. I think I was still able to get it. I just didn't like it.
Yeah, and I think that the information gleaned is going to vary from person to person. I did take some things away. There were some critical, some were reminders, some was new information. There were some things that I got from Olen Butler. And like I said, the entirety of chapter 4, the entirety of chapter 3, absolutely excellent. They're excellent in their structure. They're excellent in their presentation. It's because he cuts through all the crap of, art and artists. And it's like, no, we're going to talk about yearning now. Here's what this is. And we're going to talk about center of the mind. And here's what this is. He didn't tell you how to do anything. He gave you examples of how some authors do it, some very famous, very effective authors. And, he shored those up with his own view in an extremely palatable way. Not that everything has to be palatable, but, coming off the first 3 chapters or 2 chapters, I kind of needed that. But I think that, again, I would never tell anyone not to read something that I feel like they can glean inspiration from. I would, if I'm asked to recommend a book for a new writer, I would go On Writing, and then I would go The War of Art, and then I would go only after they've written several things and are getting more advanced. Here's From Where You Dream, take it as you will. It's a different approach, but there's valuable information there. Sometimes you just need a reminder. Sometimes it's wholly new, and it's,
I've got that one.
It's my favorite.
Which one is
What's
that?
interesting to me is Heath, while he was reading that, was inspired.
Oh yeah.
And I think, Heath, you struck me as this motivates me when I read it. I feel like I'm in control, like I can make this happen.
There's something electric that happens with creative, with people who endeavor to be creative. There's something electric that happens, and it jumps from person to person. When Sable Phoenix, again, throwing you under the bus, I'm sorry, when he came to me and he told me that he had been inspired and he was working on something, immediately I felt the intensity and the passion, and it's something that I wanted for myself. And I sat down and I set about doing it. And I think there is such value in this sort of exploration of creativity, whether you're all reading From Where You Dream as a group to convene to talk about it, or you're just discussing people, how they're coming along in their own creative endeavors. Lively art of conversation.
Yeah. I think that actually to me the most to me the most valuable that I got out of because this is rereading it now for this whole thing was I think the 4th time I've gone through From Where You Dream, because I got it. So okay, go. Let me preface a little bit. My own personal set of initial writing books would now include The War of Art. Thank you, Heath. But I got From Where You Dream with a couple other books, Stein on Writing and How to Grow a Novel by Saul Stein, which those would be my equivalents of On Writing by Stephen King. Saul Stein was an editor and author. He wrote many books himself. He worked as an editor at big publishing houses, and then he started his own publishing company.
What was the name of the book?
One is called Stein on Writing, Stein, by Saul Stein, Sol Stein. And the other is How to Grow a Novel. And both those books are utterly excellent on the craft side of things. They tell you what to do, why it works, and how to do it. and they're fantastic, and they're incredibly readable because he's also an author himself. But I also got that at the same time with From Where You Dream, which gave that super esoteric, almost metaphysical look at things. All combined together, all three of those in my head. And I think the most important thing that anybody could take, well, I shouldn't say anybody, but one of the most important things that Robert Olen Butler is trying to part through From Where You Dream is how to what he calls it, how to thrum to the work. Like he brings up that you don't, like Miles Davis, the trumpeter, right? Miles Davis said, "Man, you don't play what you think. You don't play what you know. You play what you hear." Or he also says, he brings out a New Testament example. Without a parable, he spake not unto them. He said, "He who has ears to hear, let them hear. Not he who has a brain to think, let them think."
There's a tail to that verse, though.
Oh yeah, no, I know. He's taking
and
it
then
as,
in secret he explains to his disciples what he meant by what he said. So there's a duality there.
There is, but regardless of whether he's taken the verse out of context, Butler's point is that when Jesus wanted to make a point, he told a story. He elicited an emotional response. And the whole idea is to create something that, well, like my notes here say, right out of the book, readers as well as writers need to understand that if a work of art is not the object of the mind, it's a product of the dream space, and the reader's primary encounter with this object is also in the dream space. As I mentioned earlier, as readers, you need to primarily thrum to the work. And he says, you don't listen to a Beethoven symphony or look at a Monet painting or watch Suzanne Farrell dance and walk away with your head full of ideas, having, say, sat there in your chair with the keen intellectual enjoyment of watching the way the themes of the first movement and were echoed in the second and then turned into the crescendo in the fourth. That is a separate kind of pleasure with a certain value, but it's not the immediate aesthetic response. And the whole point behind the From Where You Dream, regardless of how you engage in the process, his point is that the process is where that response comes from, because it's where your response to whatever it is that you want to impart comes from, and it's where the response from the viewer or the reader or whatever is going to come from as well.
Yeah, he says that artists are not intellectuals, and I think that was one of the
yeah.
That's an important
Basically.
But and that may be true, but I also think that a craftsman is. So you can have something that is art and that is craft that can have all those emotional responses, and it can make you think. Like as a story,
sure.
As an appreciator of stories, I don't know what the phrase is looking for. When I go and watch a movie or read a book, my favorite ones are the ones that primarily it's that I have an emotional response. It's the most important thing.
Yes.
But I also love the ones that they do that, but they also make me think. They also like some of Kurosawa's films do that.
Yes.
Like Rashomon. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but like that's an example of that was a work of art, and it was one that was intellectually engaging too. You're like, oh my God, what did happen? Who did murder? Like and then what does this say about human nature that none of these people could admit the truth? Like, I don't know. I love stories that do that, and some stories I think that whole art versus craft thing. We say it kind of depends on the individual that's creating it. I think it also kind of can depend on the thing being created. Like some things are going to lean, like it might be a continuum. I don't know. Like some things may lean more art, some things may lean more craft, or however you want to call that.
That makes sense.
And
I think art requires craft. Craft doesn't.
Yeah, I feel like my inclination is to not say it's a continuum, but to say it's more just a hybridization of both. Mm-hmm. So instead of a continuum, it's more like the degree to which both are involved may vary depending on the form. Like a great example of
contribution.
Huh?
I said it's a proportional contribution.
I'll give an example of something that is like 99% art and like almost zero. Like on a story perspective would be Mad God. So bizarre film, and it's basically just art. And
Yeah, I've seen it. It's weird.
it's so weird. But I would think about that as an art project that someone spent whatever 20 or 30 years making, rather than that's not something that's going to be a blockbuster movie, because it's a small audience for that.
Well, but some of them, like, they hit you really hard. You might not even rewatch it, but it was such an experience. Like some of the more artistic film. Have you ever seen that movie Tree of Life?
That's on my list. I know that's an artsy film, though. I know.
It's so artsy, and it's hard to rewatch. Like, I don't even know if I would ever rewatch it. But going through it once, all the way through, was pretty profound, and it was so bizarre. Anyway,
yeah,
I agree with you. Like, artsiness can be so expansive that it's hard to digest, but sometimes there's something big there, at the center.
Yeah, and I think there's value in things that are both and that are either, is kind of what I'm trying to aim at here. Like,
I think there's probably a third pillar here too. I think there's art, craft, and then message. I think that you can be artistic without a message. I think that you can be crafty without a message. But when the three unify into a single entity, when the craft is excellent and the art is emergent, there's usually a message involved.
I think the best messages are the ones that are open-ended and are absolutely inherent to the art itself,
and that are phrased as questions rather than as preaching statements.
Yeah, I think if you come in with the approach of, I'm going to teach somebody this lesson, then you're putting your thumb on top of the scale of your characters.
I agree.
This you guys, well, I figured it was going to happen. You're just kind of knocking down all these sections that I've written into my notes, because what you're just saying here, all of you guys, ties right into something that I mentioned here after. I wrote it actually right after the whole thing about the Beethoven Symphony and the Monet painting, etc. From that passage in From Where You Dream. I said that when you come into contact with a story that's firing on all cylinders, those three things that you just mentioned, it's an awesome experience. And I mean that in the old sense of the word, the full of awe, rather than that kind of watered down your slang term that it's used as today.
Full of awe.
This phenomenon, we're going to bring it back to something that you mentioned in the other table talk here a couple of days ago. This phenomenon happens with the series Arcane. There's a whole bucket load of incredibly complex storytelling going on in that show. Okay, it's layers and layers of theme and multiple plots tying into the theme, and the characters are embodiments of the theme, right? Every character has one other character that parallels some part of their arc, and then a second character somewhere else in the story that's their inverse. Like, and that doesn't even say anything about all the positive reinforcement that is going on the thematic level. That's reinforced by the visuals, that's reinforced by the music, all of which was composed specifically for the series. It's like everything in that show ties into the central themes and reinforces them. And that show, go into how Butler talks about the creative process. I don't think that show could have been written in a totally pre-planned way and wound up with everything resonating the way it did. Because it wasn't. It was rewritten multiple times. It took Fortiche about 7 years to make the first season, I think.
I love Arcane.
Yeah, it was a very iterative process.
And they kept going.
League of Legends player. Go ahead.
Kept going.
Oh, Heath, you're
muted.
Yeah, we couldn't hear you.
But they kept
I was
going.
saying that Brianna and I were just talking that we're going to be talking about Arcane. We were talking about that. So that's coming. Arcane.
Man, I'm a League of Legends player. I swore it off. I actually mained Vi and Jinx. I don't want to have anything to do with it because I'm going to get sucked back in again.
Have
you seen the show?
No. I've never touched. The show doesn't have anything to do with.
I know, but I'm going to look
totally detached.
I have no desire to play the game. Never played the game.
and I've never played the game, and same as Brianna. And yet that show, man, I wept. I outright wept twice in that show.
I'm going to end up having to watch it. I know I'm going to end up having to watch it.
I feel like if I were to play the game, I'd be so disappointed because it would not live up to
100%.
Oh, yes.
100%. There's a reason why I'm an ex-player.
Yeah, they have these sort of archetypes, these kind of simple characters that you can play in a game. And then they went and turned them into full-fledged people with just
They are so
complexity and
deep.
flaws.
They are so
what's
deep.
funny is
and
they've
it's
tried,
not-
you
Go
know,
ahead.
Harley Quinn. I've seen so many shows try to capture this idea of like the chaotic female character, and they never do a good job with that. They
Yeah.
always make it look artificial. Not this show.
Holy cow! Yeah.
Jinx is awesome. She's one of my favorite characters.
Yeah, and you really
Silco-
feel
Silco's the
for her,
best
and
one.
you realize it's not necessarily cute. Like, oh,
No.
it's so cutesy. That
No,
it's
there's
like you're concerned for her. like
Oh, sure.
she needs help.
By the
But all
time
of this,
you're
but
good.
here's the thing, though. Here's my point I'm going to make about this. None of that resonates because we sit there and analyze it,
Correct.
right? The audience responds to all of this multiple layers and this stuff that took multiple iterations to get to. We respond to it on an instinctual level because at some point the writers and creators are doing it instinctually. And here's how I know too. After watching it multiple times, I watched it straight through twice. And then I went and watched reactions to it over and over and over again. I've probably watched through the show in total, although not necessarily beginning to end, 8-9 times.
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
More than that. I'm sure more actually. And even after that, even after I knew that other than one singular little plot hole in episode 4, the entire series just thrums all the way through.
Mm.
And I still couldn't tell you why it worked so well for a lot of it. Until I got into, I started watching somebody's channel who analyzed it in amazing detail and I was like, oh yeah, that's why that works so well.
But that's a good
He's here on
sign.
YouTube and
But
does a
that
bunch of
person
analysis.
analyzed it though, didn't they?
He did, but he went through a Jewish, I think he's Jewish, and he went through a Jewish school, and they taught critical thinking as a skill and analysis as a skill. And even he says, I sit down and I just think about, I take a part of that series. I'm like, okay, why is this scene the way it is? And I just go through that same process that I was taught in college to find the pieces and then extract them and put the picture together so I can describe it and do what Robert. But that's the whole point that Robert Olen Butler is making too, is like, you don't do that in a work of art. That's something you do after the fact.
I don't
In
know.
the moment-
I still
in
don't
the
think I
moment, in
agree
the
with that, though,
experience.
because
Yeah, I
what
don't
makes
agree either.
like the people that were writing that show,
But
they were
okay,
doing
here's
that all
the-
on purpose. I do not think they were going, I'm gonna just see what comes from my white hot center. Like they might have
No,
been
not
like, quick
consciously.
drafts,
No, absolutely not consciously. They were not doing that consciously. But
but
why did they go
were
through so
using
many? Why did
techniques.
they go through so many rewrites though? Because something didn't feel right, and that's the thing. That's the thing that we do all the time. Is like, how many times have we watched a film or read a book and we say something's off, but I can't put my finger on it.
Yeah, and
Right,
sometimes
but if you analyze, you can eventually arrive at putting
right,
your
like
finger
the
on it.
Yeah.
intuitive self
Or
helps
you
you
just-
realize when it's wrong, but it's the analytical self that helps you fix it.
Like here's I have
Well,
an
that-
example is here. I have the Heath, that Atlantic article that you brought up about AI with Stephen King, how Stephen King is being used to learn. So here he says, I wrote a scene in a forthcoming book that may illustrate this point. A character creeps up on another character and shoots him in the back of the head with a small revolver. When the shooter rolls the dead man over, he sees a small bulge in the man's forehead. The bullet did not quite come out, you see. When I sat down that day, I knew the murder was going to happen. I knew it was going to be murder by gun. But he didn't know about the bulge. That was a genuine creative moment. And so I think the same thing was likely true of the people who sat down to write Arcane.
Yeah.
They knew what they wanted to happen. They structured the story, but they allowed for genuine creative moments. And I think that the rewrites are likely the result of that, because if you're engaging your subconscious to evoke these creative moments, and the creativity that's brought about by your subconscious is high in novelty but low in application or appropriateness, you're gonna have to rewrite sometimes, because maybe the idea that you came up with, maybe the percolating idea is not something that's appropriate for the show. Maybe the writers had too much freedom. I mean, there's any number of things that could have contributed to those rewrites. But one of the things that I feel like would definitely have to is analysis, because if you're trying to hit very certain beats with very specific emotional punches, then you're going to want to break it down to the human experience level, and you're going to want to analyze the relationships between characters, and you're going to want to provide for the audience the most base relatable experience.
There has to be an analysis.
That's not what
Can I just
they
say real
did.
quickly?
Go ahead.
In Arcane, the subsequent drafts were not by the same people. It was people that were less experienced in
Yes.
storytelling, and it wasn't working. And they hired industry professional writers who have all these techniques and craft who came in and made it better. That was what happened.
Well, and experience too. But that's the thing, though, too, is that at least somebody in a position to put the brakes on was saying, no, something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we can't figure it out.
Analysis is, what are you, like, from what lens are you analyzing it? So, like, when I'm writing a chapter, I'll write it out, in that raw sense. And then it's like I toss it over to my analytical side and I'm looking through it and I adjust it, but I'm still analyzing it in a sense.
I love that
creative impact.
And I know exactly what you're talking about, Doug. And going back to what you said, Brianna, that happens too early and it just garrotes your entire creative process. It strangles right there. So
yeah, the intellectual I'll invite in, but then I got to kick them out.
Exactly. And I think, if nothing else, I think that is the most important. Maybe I've been dancing around it this whole time. I don't know, but I think that's what Butler's getting at, right?
Well, I think they work. I don't know if Butler gets at that specifically. I do think that intellect and the creative, whatever it is, work in tandem. I think that you allow creativity to bubble to the surface, and then you have to have your conscious analytical mind engage to A, catch it before it disappears, and B, decide whether or not it's appropriate, and then C, massage it into something that fits what you need it to fit. So I think they work in tandem.
The intellectual 100%. Side works for my creative side.
But I don't know if Butler necessarily goes in that direction, because there are multiple times throughout the book where he says memory is the enemy. Don't
literal memory.
It's not intellectual.
Not memory, literal memory. There's a difference that he makes. He says literal memory is the enemy because that's intransigent. You stick that literal memory in the middle of your work of art and it can't change, and it just poisons everything around it.
Oh, okay.
Whereas if you are taking memory from the level of sense experience and melding it all together in the compost heap. By the way, I went and found the actual quote of that author that he quotes.
So did I.
It was Graham Greene says, perhaps a novelist has a greater ability to forget than other men. He has to forget or become sterile. What he forgets is the compost of the imagination. And the whole idea is you can't take your literal memories and transcribe them, because that is not creativity.
Mm-hmm.
That's reporting. That's journalism. There's another quote by Graham Greene makes a distinction between journalism and literature. But if you use that memory as compost, and you can create something new out of it that is evocative.
Well, then I'm misunderstood when he said memory is the enemy. But the point still stands, because several times throughout the book he says, don't write from your mind, don't use your mind, don't use your intellect. And so I don't know if he's necessarily driving at a hybrid method, which may very well work for him, and it may work for several other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the best advice you can give is the advice that you take yourself. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing to say. I just don't know necessarily if he's going in that direction. I didn't get that.
He's not concentrating on it, although he does mention it a couple of times. And at some point you have to engage on the craft, otherwise you'll never create anything. And so obviously he does, because he's produced books and stories and whatever. He's actually published stuff. Yeah. His whole point is that process comes first. This whole liminal space where you enter and create unstructured, that comes first. Which I think that Brianna, actually, from everything I've understood that you've been saying, that's kind of the way that you create too, is that subconscious, highly creative, emotional stuff comes first, and then you have to pound it into shape with the craft. Robert Olen Butler actually states that we teach too much right now. We're teaching the craft first, and then people try to write purely from the craft, where people should have the process down first, and then you earn the craft.
Well, I
Does
think
that make sense?
That's a fair point.
I agree. That's
So
fair.
it's a good balancing. Like other people have said this already, but like there's a fair amount of balancing that comes from a book like this, despite its flaws, because it's providing that other side of creativity that is essential, and I do agree that it is essential.
And this,
I don't know. I think it is for me personally. I don't know if it's for everyone, but I think it is.
Well, and to be honest, the creative side is the hardest part to put into a book because creativity is like
how do you
anarchy?
Anarchy, yes.
You know, so like it's hard to try to start cordoning it off. That's why all these other books focus on craft and an analysis, because that's an orderly way of thinking. So it presents well in terms of a book. But if you want to get into the creative side, you know, it's just a little bit harder to bottle up and to hand off to somebody, because if I hand off my creative process to Brianna, she might be like, that's not how I do it, you know, and she would be right to throw it away. So, you know, it's just harder to relate on the creative side because it is so distinctive. And like I said, it is anarchy in there. It's an anarchy. It's expansive and a little bit harder to describe.
Mystical.
And he tried, you know,
he says that too. It's like we get lost in the technicals because that's easy, right? You got a million books out there. You can go and talk with anybody who can tell you how, but the hard part is getting into that creative space.
Do you guys remember a book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron?
Never heard of it.
No,
I have not.
It's an older book. It's pretty dated, but it was one of the first books I read. This back in the 90s, maybe, where she was attempting to approach it from the creative anarchic side. She had all these exercises. She wanted a special journal, you know, and it helped me understand that there are two versions of myself as a writer. There's there's the side of me that is an editor, that is a mathematician, that is a grammarian, and the math side of me. And then there's the other side that is the kid, the one that's all over the place. So, you know, she got me in touch with that side, and that side is important because I do think when you're a student, the inclination is to go with the craft side.
Yes.
So you do start to intellectualize to the point where I think, you know, what he was trying to do is like, you know, bump that out of there and be like, look, you have to get back to the side that your first teachers told you, stop being all over the place and start learning the craft of writing, which is good advice. But then you get to the point where they're like, okay, now take the craft, throw it out, and get in touch with your creative side again. So I do think,
you know, what's funny about that is that I think it's something like over 90% of all of our thought we have no control over. Like over 90% of our thought is subconscious thought. It's all just your brain firing off in random ways. And over the course of a lifetime, you learn and practice to ignore it so that you are focused on the controlled thought. So we you know,
to unlearn what you've learned.
Yeah, we are likely more creative than we think we are.
Yoda.
That actually, dude, I just lost my point now.
Oh, dang.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, it's not your fault. That was what I was going to say. You study the craft until it becomes second nature, just like Michael Jordan with the layup. And then it doesn't get in the way of the creative process. Again, one of the key points that Butler makes. But I've got another note to get to that's non sequitur to what we're just talking about. If everybody,
that's okay. I have a non sequitur too, and I'm going to just shove it in right here. When I recommended books, I wasn't recommending books that I think are the best. I was just recommending the books in an order that they came up in this stream. If I'm actually recommending my favorite books on writing, it's going to be Snyder Saves the Cat and McKee's Story. Story is first. McKee's Story is first. It is.
I hear people reference that one a lot.
It's the first book I ever read on the creative writing process. It is by far the book that I got the most out of, and I think that I would recommend that first above anything.
Save the Cat.
Cool.
No, that Story is the thing I'm recommending above everything. Save the Cat Save the Cat is a follow-up to that. I think that it's an irreverent, easy read, and I think that there's really a lot to it.
Oh, okay. Awesome.
So there's my non sequitur. Sorry about that.
Now it's time for your non sequitur.
Going back into, and this is coming back from, this is probably what I found the funniest part, but also a fantastic thought or insight about what art is from Where You Dream, where he talks about that hill with that long Maori name, right? It's like the hill's name is translated into English something along the lines of the place where this guy's name with big knees who ran and slid and swallowed mountains, named Landeater, played on the flute to his loved one. And that is the name of the hill, right? Which I thought was great. But
I
then
wonder if they have nicknames for it.
I don't know.
You need
But no, but his
probably
point
like
is,
the hill.
Yeah, or like the
his
South
point
Hill.
is that he says so too. He says how would you shorten that, right? That is a story in and of itself. That concept, if you reduce it, it is no longer that thing. It's a nickname. And then he goes and says a novel for all its length. He says, I can't remember who said this, but he brings it in here. He says, I can't remember who said this, but I remember reading somewhere that a novel for all its length is just an extremely long name for a complex evolving emotion that has no name but that.
I remember liking that sentence from there. Yeah.
I thought that was a brilliant insight.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always thought of a novel as a fully articulated dream.
Yes.
One that we get a hold of and we craft it to our
It comes
exact
from Where You Dream, man.
Exactly. That's why I do think that there's extreme value in the book. But I recognize the criticism
Sure.
that the book has.
Absolutely.
But I do think there is that core idea that is very vital. It even reminds me. Have you guys seen the movie Ex Machina?
No,
Yeah.
we need to talk
I
about that.
want
Make
to.
it to the list. I love
It's a
that.
great
It's
book,
on my
but
list.
he's talking about sexual attraction, and he's like, do you calculate that? Do you analyze every positive? He's like, no, it's there. And I feel like that's part of the creative process too. And so from Where You Dream is that's what I want. That I like that.
Work.
Yes.
This
It comes up on its own. Like I didn't analyze this. This thing came up and this is what I've got. And then my craftsman side has to do something with that. And I do think that is the right order.
On that note, another thing I want to say that's in defense of the concepts in this book, that sometimes, again, I'm speaking from personal experience, but sometimes I found that I've had kind of like with kind of a similar thing that you had, Doug, with needing that to return to that space after being analytical, writing nonfiction. I've had that happen to me where I was getting so like involved in thinking analytically with technique and whatnot that I was starting to not listen to the intuitive self. So I would have an intuitive feeling for example, like a scene, like there's an image that I'm like, this, I feel like this has to happen, but then I couldn't make it sense intellectually. I'd be like, well, actually maybe intellectually it should be this. And then eventually I would end up coming back to that original thing. And I was like, I would have saved time if I just listened to my intuition and just trusted, because I know that it has things to say. And eventually I'll realize why it was saying that. That's like,
Kill your darlings.
Huh?
That's
Kill your darlings.
This is the opposite, though.
That's the opposite.
This is me saying that the darling, it's complicated because obviously there's situations where you don't do that, but there's it's a balancing act, right? It's like realizing that like if you're having a very strong intuitive feeling about something, especially if it's an archetypal kind of thing, like what you talked about, Doug, with like it resonates on that level of like when myth resonates, and like it's like when I'm feeling that feeling, I've learned now to listen to it because it saves time. Eventually I'll come back to that conclusion. So,
that's what Butler is saying is the process too, right? Mm-hmm. He outright says, I don't care how smart you are. Your mind is stupid artistically. As writers, we must have compassion for all the characters we create. If we're going to play God, we have to be a loving God, and you can't love with your brain. and he says
everything comes from your brain. Like, but I get it.
No, yes. Actually, no. Because neurologically speaking, most of what you experience comes from your gut.
Well, that's
what I
true.
was gonna
80 to
say is,
90%
like-
of your neurotransmitters come from your gut. That's why we
No,
call
that
it
is
a gut
true, but
feeling.
that is part of the mind in general. It's
Yeah,
like
it's
But what I'm
neurological.
saying is, like,
Yeah.
think
It's
about it like this. Like,
neurological.
you have intuition and intellect, right?
Yes.
Intuition is a shortcut. You know, it's a shortcut. If you're in the woods and a dog's running up, I don't say, what's my strategy? I'm just like, oh geez, and I start running.
Right.
Thank God we cut through the intellectual process and went straight to the instinct, because that
The intellect
works.
is slow.
So that's how I feel about the creative process. Like when you start intellectualizing, it's like you sitting there, what are my strategy? While a dog's charging in at you, you're trying to figure out what your best options are. No, you need to go right into the intuitive, instinctive mode. And that's it's reliable.
and
is
it's
what I-
circumstantially dependent, because if you're going to war and you're a general and you're planning your battle against another very an intelligent general, then you're going to sit there and strategize and be like, how can I outmaneuver this guy? But there's a dog chasing
Unless
you
you're
right now.
Well, even that strategizing at a high level is creative problem solving. There's absolutely a creative element to a general
That's
sitting
what I
down
meant
in front of
earlier.
a
That's why-
board
yeah,
and
that's why
following
About
your
which
information from
lens
them.
you're intellectually looking through.
Yeah.
Because when I'm looking at my story for revisions, it depends. Sometimes I'm doing a line edit. I am not thinking creatively. I am being very specific about that line edit. Other times I'm like, what does it sound right? Other times it's like, is this what I meant to say? So there is a lens. Even when you're intellectualizing, you're focusing that lens on something specific usually. And sometimes it's story structure,
Yeah.
Yeah. And analysis can be satisfying in its own right.
Oh yeah, analysis.
That's why
is
I'm
a
an
lot of
editor.
fun.
I just
analysis
I
is
love
a lot of fun.
Love it.
Analysis, I really like analysis.
Analysis is a
itself.
lot of fun, we say, after a 3-hour and 20-minute analysis.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, this whole thing has been analysis. I
No,
love it.
but
So what's the takeaway, everyone? Analysis is fun. See y'all next time.
Analysis is fun.
You gotta have it.
learned
Like,
from
it's
all of
gotta
this.
be there.
But you can't. But yeah.
But in service for creative people, I think it
service
should be in
of-
service of creativity.
the analysis is secondary to the aesthetic experience, because you don't like how many times have we only appreciate the show until we see the man behind the curtain, and once that is exposed, the jig's up. How many times do you hear about some expert who goes in some situation, some particular field rather, who goes into a movie, and that field and some situation involved in that field comes up in the movie and they get it totally wrong, and it ruins the movie for that expert. Why? Nobody else noticed, but he did, because he knows the details, right? The intellectual details, and it took him out of the experience, and he started analyzing. And that's actually what we call, by the way, that's what we call suspension of disbelief. It's not necessarily that the story makes sense. This goes back to something that you've mentioned a couple times, Heath, that Star Trek VI as a plot has all sorts of weird things that happen that don't actually make sense, but it works as a story. And so you just thrum along with it, right? You don't
It's
care
internal logic.
because you're not
As long as it
analyzing.
doesn't break its own internal logic. then
Exactly.
You can suspend your disbelief.
That's
So-
what I always get a kick out of the people who defend the sequel trilogy. They're like, well, the original trilogy had these problems. I'm like, but it was a cultural phenomenon.
Well,
you could try to say it's the same.
Yeah, of course it has problems because of the limitations of the medium. You can't present everything anyway. And the limitations of the creators, we as humans are fallible. We're not going to cover every contingency. But if we can tap into that archetypal experience and the audience is just thrumming along and going along with the ride, they're not going to sit there and start picking apart plot holes, because that would ruin the experience that they're in the middle of enjoying. But as soon as you throw anything in there that's going to put a speed bump in their way, boom, twang, as Robert Olen Butler calls it.
Twang.
Wait, that note didn't land right. That's not in the proper chord. And then, oh wow, that means that all of those other notes that we just saw, those don't quite fit either. And then you
breaks
start,
magic.
you lose. Yeah, if it's good enough, if you're firing on all cylinders and you're just going along, your story can survive one, maybe two of those. and the audience.
Yeah,
will
Harry
be like,
Potter does
wait a minute. But now I'm back into the story. And it was a bump and it was a twang, but it wasn't bad enough to break the immersion. Whereas if you, again, that's why Butler is saying process is so important. You look at it from the experiential level before you translate it into the specifics of your craft. And as long as the experience flows, you give yourself grace for the inevitable missteps in craft.
Yeah, that's a good note that like you can there's a limit to how many of those twangs you can have. It's like probably like one or two. I think that's I think by the time you hit the third one, you're done.
George R. R. Martin talks about that.
This movie dumb,
George R. R. Martin.
He talks about the twangs.
Well, yeah, when he's talking about like in the story, in his history of writing the books, he was talking about the books and the Song of Ice and Fire. And some people have brought up in interviews, well, does this actually make sense, or was this a misfire? And he's like, and he'll admit, like, yeah, there have been a few times that I stubbed my toe. That was his word, when this was going, when I was trying to write this, but it still kept going because those were few and far enough between that it still kept going. So.
I may have gone too far in some places.
I may have gone too. That's right, Lucas. I may have gone too far a couple of times. Right?
It's like poetry,
I like Stray's comment here. Says that's a good book title. Analysis in the Name of Creativity.
I love that.
If there's ever an ultimate book that comes out of Table Talk,
that's
probably that title. Right?
Absolutely, that will be.
It should be 5 chapters, one for each of us.
That will be the first collaborative project.
I want to make a quick aside. That is just because I just have the opportunity to complain that to an audience that will listen. So one of the things that really, really breaks the immersion for me is it's a historical movie. This is always in movies. Sometimes books do it too because they copy movies. It's a movie and people have bow and arrow. And this happens in Game of Thrones actually. And they go like this and they're threatening someone. And they're holding it and they're holding it and they're holding it and they're holding like that's physically impossible.
Yep.
You cannot do that. It's not a gun.
It's going to be the last shot you ever fire. Your arm's going to be
what you would do is you would start to draw it because it's a split second to just draw it all the way and you don't fire an arrow. You loose an arrow.
You loose an
Yeah,
arrow.
I thought that's where you were going. That somebody's saying something like fire an arrow.
Don't fire an arrow. You
That's
loose an arrow.
They do that in the Lord of the Rings.
Firearm.
It's ridiculous.
And and so you cannot hold. It's not. Doesn't the strongest archer in the world can only hold it for like I don't know. It's like a few seconds or something. I don't know what the exact is, but just one. Just please.
I actually think Brianna, 100%. That would be another great title. For a book that comes out of Table Talk, ultimately.
You don't fire an arrow, you lose one?
No, the title being Complaining to an Audience Who Will Listen.
By Brianna de Silva.
Beautiful.
Whoever buys it,
you've got a lot of chapters on that.
So we're going to create our own library.
Do you know the worst thing about this too? Oh, this is important for novelists to understand. When you this is about bows and arrows again. When you draw back an arrow, it doesn't. When you draw back a bow, it doesn't make a sound. You know, in movies where it goes, that's a movie. That's just movie stuff because it just psychologically feels like it should make a sound. It's kind of like someone moves a gun, it goes click, click. It's like, what is it doing? I don't know. It's just movie. It's just movies being movies. So do not write in your novels that it's creaking because they don't actually do that. The funniest was I read a novel once where someone kept describing bow strings creaking. Strings. That's the sound of
not
wood.
Even the wood of the bow.
This was a published novel. Anyway.
Yeah.
You know what's funny is I
So
once had someone
goes
editing.
back to people with no actual experience in what they're writing. Right?
This
No
person
actual life
clearly never
experience.
researched anything about this. They just had watched movies.
Yeah.
I had an editor one time who was editing something I wrote, and the phrase I wrote was loose an arrow. And they crossed it out. They're like, nope, this should be lose. And I'm like, first off, the sentence doesn't make sense. And you don't know your medieval terminology.
That's right.
I was so disappointed.
Yeah, that takes me out of the Battle of Helm's Deep. I love the Battle of Helm's Deep. But when Aragorn orders fire.
Oh, he orders fire. I didn't even.
Oh,
remember that.
Actually, Elrond does in the prequel, in the preview sequence at the start of the first movie too.
Yeah, that's right.
It's like fire, and the elves loose their arrows, and the wind of the
Why
arrows
would you do
blows
that?
past his hair. Yeah. I know.
Those are the twangs we put up with.
Those are the twangs.
That we're nerds and we know these things. So
That's right.
Another one that gets me while we're on this particular subject is being a turncoat.
being a turncoat. Yeah, that's a yeah.
Yeah. So as far as I know, and people can fact check me in the comments, but that's an American Revolution thing.
Yeah.
Because that term specifically comes to the American Revolution when you would turn your coat inside out, and there was a red lining or that specifically.
I'm not an American.
Yeah, so that's an American Revolutionary term, a turncoat.
Yeah.
And so when you have people in like a medieval story talk about being, they do that in the Robin Hood. That's the Kevin Costner Robin Hood.
Oh, Prince of
and
Thieves.
I even remember that as a kid. He goes, "Oh, the turncoat." But that's not a term that he ever would have known.
Yeah, that's an anachronism.
That is an error I made in an early draft of City of Reckoning, and I wonder if it was you, Heath, that caught it. I don't remember who it was.
Maybe
someone did. It might have been you. I don't know.
Well, in Faraway Bird, I used the term gypsy,
yeah,
which I thought was a universal term of migrant. No, someone caught this. I researched and I was like, "Son of a gun!" So I had all these references to like. Not all, but I maybe 7 or 8 references to the word gypsy in the 6th century. And I had to go back and change it to migrant or transient. Like I had to find
they are a
words.
discreet people.
That's right.
Yeah,
they are the Romani.
Benedict Arnold. Yes, exactly. Benedict Arnold.
Would you guys it feels a little bit like we're starting to wrap up here, but would you guys indulge me for the first 5 pages of the Eagle of the Ninth, like I was talking about earlier? Because it is a master class in every one of the techniques of the sensory techniques and the thematic techniques that Robert Olen Butler talks about, as well as just
3 minutes. Go.
All right.
I'll have to wrap up to the conversation.
I'm kidding.
Okay. So forward. Sometime about AD 117, the 9th Legion, which was stationed at Ibericum, where York now stands, marched north to deal with a rising among the Caledonian tribes and was never heard from again. During the excavations at Silchester nearly 1,800 years later, there was dug up under the green fields, which now cover the pavements of the Caliva Atrabatum, a wingless Roman eagle, a cast of which can be seen to this day in the Reading Museum. Different people have had different ideas as to how it came to be there, but no one knows, just as no one knows what happened to the 9th Legion after it marched into the northern mists. It is from these two mysteries, brought together, that I have made the story of the Eagle of the Ninth. Chapter 1, Frontier Fort. From the Fossaway westward to Iscadunnorum, the road was simply a British trackway, broadened and roughly metalled, strengthened by corduroys of logs in the softest places, but otherwise unchanged from its old estate, as it wound among the hills, thrusting further and further into the wilderness. It was a busy road and saw many travelers, trading with bronze weapons and raw yellow amber in their ponies' packs, country folk driving shaggy cattle or lean pigs from village to village, sometimes a band of tawny-haired tribesmen from farther west, strolling harpers and quack oculists too, or a light-stepping hunter with huge wolfhounds at his heels, and from time to time a commissariat wagon going up and down to supply the Roman frontier posts. The road saw them all, and the cohorts of the eagles, for whom all other travelers must make way. There was a cohort of leather-clad auxiliaries on the road today, swinging along at the steady legionnaire's pace that had brought them down from Isca Celerium at 20 miles a day, a new garrison coming to relieve the old at Iscadunnorum. On they went, following the road that now ran out on a causeway between sodden marsh and empty sky, now plunged into deep, boar-hunted forests, or lifted over bleak uplands where nothing grew save firs and thorn scrub. On, with never a halt nor a change of rhythm, marching century by century, the sun bright on the standard at their head, and the rolling dust cloud kicked up over the pack team behind. At the head of the column marched the Pulis Prior Centurion, the cohort commander, the pride that shone from him showing clearly that this was his first command. They were, he had long since decided, a command worthy of anyone's pride. 600 yellow-haired giants recruited from the tribes of Upper Gaul, with the natural fighting power of mountain cats, drilled and hammered into what he firmly believed was the finest auxiliary cohort to ever serve with the 2nd Legion. They were a newly joined cohort. Many of the men had not yet proved themselves in action, and the spear shaft of their standard had no honors on it, no gilded laurel wreath, nor victor's crown. The honors were all to win, perhaps during his command. The commander was a complete contrast to his men, Roman to his arrogant fingertips, wiry and dark as they were raw-boned and fair. The olive-skinned face under the curve of his crested helmet had not a soft line in it anywhere. A harsh face it would have been, but that it was winged with laughter lines, and between his level black brows showed a small raised scar that marked him for one who had passed the raven degree of Mithras. Centurion Marcus Flavius Aquila had seen little of the Eagles until a year ago. His first 10 years had been lived quietly with his mother on a family farm near Clusium, while his father soldiered in Judea, in Egypt, and here in Britain. They had been going to join his father in Britain, but before the time had come for them to do so, rebellion had flared up among the northern tribes, and the 9th Hispania, his father's legion, had marched north to deal with it, and never come marching back. His mother had died soon afterward, leaving him to be brought up in Rome by a rather foolish aunt and the plump and purse-proud official who was her husband. Marcus had loathed the official, and the official had loathed Marcus. They saw everything with different eyes. Marcus came of a line of soldiers, one of those equestrian families that, when the rest of their kind had turned from soldiering to trade and finance, had kept the old way of life and remained poor, but held their noses high in consequence. The official came of a line of officials, and his code of life was quite rather other than Marcus. Neither of them had a shred of understanding for the other's ideas, and they had both been thankful when Marcus was 18 and could apply for a centurion's commission. Marcus, his eyes narrowed into the sun as he marched, smiled to himself a little wryly as he remembered how almost pathetically thankful that plump official had been. Tramp, 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 said the cohort's feet behind him. He had asked to be sent to Britain, though it meant starting an auxiliary cohort instead of a line of battle one, partly because his father's elder brother had settled there when his own years of soldiering were done, but mostly because of his father. If ever anything had become known of the Lost Legion, it would be known first in Britain, and it might even be here in Britain that he would find something for himself. Marching down the Iscadumniorum road in the run honey evening light, he found himself thinking about his father. He had a very vivid memory of a slight dark man with laughter lines at the corners of his eyes, who had come home from time to time and taught him to fish, to play flash the fingers, and to throw a javelin. He remembered vividly the last leave of all. His father had just been appointed to command the first cohort of the Hispania, which meant having charge of the Eagle and being something very like second in command of the Legion besides, and he'd been a jubilant boy about it. But his mother had been faintly anxious, almost as if she knew. "If it were any other Legion," she had said, "you have told me yourself that the Hispania has a bad name." And his father had replied, "But I would not have it any other Legion if I could. I held my first command in the Hispania, and a man's first Legion is apt to hold his chief place in its heart ever after, be it good name or bad. And now that I go back to it as first cohort, we will see whether there is nothing to be done to better its name." He had turned to his small son, laughing. "Presently it will be your turn. It has fallen on evil days, but we will make a Legion of the Hispania yet, you and I." Looking back across the years, Marcus remembered that his father's eyes had been very bright, like the eyes of a man going into action, and the light had caught suddenly in the great flawed emerald on the signet ring he always wore, striking from it a spark of clear green fire. Odd how one remembered things like that, little things that somehow mattered. Tramp, tramp, tramp came the sound of the cohort's feet behind him. It would be pleasant, he thought, if Uncle Aquila were like his father. He had not met his uncle yet. After learning his foot drill, he had arrived in Britain in the sleety days of autumn and been sent straight up to Isca. But he had a rather vague invitation to spend his leave with him in Caliva when he had any leave to spend. It would be very pleasant if Uncle Aquila looked like his father. Not, of course, that he and his uncle were likely to have much to do with each other. In a few years' time, he would be probably serving in a quite different part of the empire, since the cohorts of Carian seldom moved up all the way in the same legion. All the way. From his present rank, right up to his father's rank of first cohort. And after that? For most of the men who'd got so far, there was nothing after that. But for the few outstanding who went further, as Marcus intended to go further, the way is divided there. One could become a camp commandant, as Uncle Aquila had done, or he could go on to be part of the Praetorian Guard and try for command of Legion. Legion commanders were almost always men of senator's rank, with no experience of soldiering save a year's service as military tribune in their youth. But by long custom, the 2 Egyptian legions were exceptions to the rule. They were commanded by professional soldiers, and an Egyptian legion had been Marcus' shining goal for as long as he could remember. But one day, when he had finished with the Eagles, when he had made an honorable name and become a prefect of his Egyptian legion, he would go home to the Etruscan hills and perhaps even buy back the old farm which the plump official had so ruthlessly sold to defray expenses. For a moment he remembered almost painfully The sunlit courtyard flickered over with the shadow of pigeons' wings and the wild olive tree in the loop of the stream, on a twisting root of which he had once found a kind of gall growing, which was shaped something like a little bird. He had cut it from the root with the new knife his father had given him and spent much loving care, one absorbed southern evening, trimming and carving feathers into it. He had that little bird still. The road topped a gentle rise, and suddenly Iscadunum lay before him with the fortress-crowned red mount, dark with shadows against the evening sky. And Marcus came back to the present with a jerk. The farm in the Etruscan hills could wait until he was old and tired and famous. In the present was the glory of his first command. The British town was spread below the southern scarp of the mount, a sprawling huddle of reed-thatched roof of every color from the gold of honey to the black of dried peat, according to the age of the thatch, with the squared, clean lines of the Roman Forum and the Basilica looking oddly rootless in their midst, and the faint haze of wood smoke lying over all. What's that?
That was pretty cool.
April
wants you to do an audiobook. Straight wants you to do an audiobook.
The reason I'm bringing this in is, number one, like I've mentioned before, Rosemary Sutcliffe is my favorite author, and these are my favorite books of all time.
What book was that?
The Eagle of the Ninth.
Eagle.
Yeah, the Eagle.
There's a really bad movie made about it.
Don't ever watch the movie. I was so mad. The Eagle of the Ninth is the first one. The Silver Branch is the second, and the Lantern Bearers is the third. Highly, highly recommended.
The Eagle of the Ninth is double entendre. Marcus Flavius Aquilus. Aquilus means eagle.
Yes, Aquila. Yes.
So it's parallelly about the lost icon and the individual.
Interesting.
And this is where I'm tying it back to what Butler talks about, where every part resonates with every other part in a work of art. Because this is a work of art. Obviously, she was a wordsmith, and she's employing all of the techniques talked about. Filmic. You start off with a high camera shot from way above the road, seeing it crossing all of these different types of landscapes. And then you zoom down like a helicopter shot, coming down and seeing all the individual types of people going through in fast motion. This is fast motion, not cuts, right? And going through time at accelerated rate. And then as you zoom down, it takes you into the cohort where all other travelers must make way. And then you see the cohort, and then you zoom down to the front of the cohort, and then to the commander, and then to the face of the commander. And you're sliding the camera in closer and closer and closer. And then you get into his sensory impressions, and he's going back into the past and forward, and then he's coming back into the tramping of the feet. And then it goes into another flashback, and he thinks about his father, and he thinks about the ring catching the light in it, the flawed emerald ring, which, by the way, going back to thematically and every part resonating with the whole, that ring becomes a fixture of the entire trilogy to the point where it plays a part in the resolution of the third book. And then out forward, he projects forward into what he's going to do. And within all of this, you immediately are connected with his yearnings or his desires, pride, fame, glory for the legions. But most importantly, that's the surface. What's really going on, he wants to find his father. Right? Like, all of those pieces are all working seamlessly, subtly, but the whole thing. I mean, were you guys enraptured by that?
Yeah, I thought it was excellent.
Okay,
no, it was very good. I was getting
inferiority.
it was thrumming the whole time, right? Thrum. It just draws you in.
There were certain times
it was all right.
Drawn in.
What?
I was getting like auto-populated images.
Yes.
Specifically with like sunlight. It was just hit me right.
She loves to describe light. There's one where she in the fourth book, which is a semi-sequel to this trilogy called The Sword at Sunset, she has the main character, who is a King Arthur analog, actually, draw the sword that will become Excalibur, and let the light run like water down the blade, is what she calls it.
Ah, nice.
Flavius actually means golden or blonde specifically, but that may have been an intentional choice on her behalf, as she plays a lot with light. Also, the colloquial of Flavius can mean blue or sorrowful. So there's another sort of lead into that it's almost triple entendre with the Lost Eagle of the Ninth, because it's an icon and an individual, and now is also lamenting and mourning.
Well, and what's cool is sometimes when you're constructing these scenes, you don't know you're doing it.
Oh, sure.
You know, sometimes a person reading it in a writing class will pick up on something, and you're like, "Oh man,
yeah," because it's all coming up subconsciously.
Yeah,
it's all subconscious pieces just fitting together. Exactly.
Yeah, but she's absolutely fantastic, and I Sable and I have talked about this book before. I absolutely recommend.
It sounds great. I want to read it. It's hard. So I found out that the historical fiction has a certain market past about to World War II. Once you go beyond that, the further back in time you go, the harder it is to sell the history of the era, to really capture it. And this person's doing a great job to kind of make to build out a panoramic for the mind to kind of fit into that.
She's got some of the best word pictures I've ever read.
I love it.
There's one part towards the end of the third book where a big battle scene is approaching, and she describes the Saxon host approaching with the shadow of the storm clouds like a torn cloak behind them, and wherever it was under the shadow, it was like this formless dark mass. But whenever the sunlight broke through, it awoke into this pulsing beetle-winged brilliance. Like it's so good. I cannot recommend the books highly enough.
That's awesome.
So that's.
Well, I put it on my list. I'm looking for some good historical fiction like that.
Yeah, I brought it up too.
This trilogy covers. Each one covers one figure from different generations of the family that's founded by Marcus Flavius Aquila from the first book, and I think, and it covers from where in Marcus time, Rome is securing its foothold in northern Britain, is still expanding, to the final book where the Roman legions are recalled to the capital, which has been sacked by the Goths, and the eagles fly from Britain and leave behind the Roman citizenry to do as they can in the face of the Saxons.
Which sacking? 410 or 476?
The latter one, or
476. The one that ends.
Was it? No, it had to have been 410 because the Roman Empire was still there. It's just they're pulling back their military reserves.
Yeah, 410 is technically the most traumatizing one.
Yeah, it would have been the 410 one because Rome is still Rome, but it's pulling back all its reserves. And the far-flung colonies like Iberia and especially Britain and what have you are not considered profitable enough to maintain a hold on anymore.
That's a
and then they tie
supply line.
and then she ties that in. One of the characters, Artos the bear, is her historical equivalent of King Arthur, who the Sword at Sunset.
Why is Heath having such an evil smile right now?
Well, because we've talked about that character on my channel.
Yes.
That there's a character in Rabivania card called Artos the bear.
Yes,
King Arthur. That's it. He's the King Arthur character.
Oh wow,
Artos the bear.
You have like an Arthurian archetype.
Yeah, in Rabivania, right? And I didn't even think about it at the time as I was writing it because they're all rabbits. But he's Artos the bear. But I have to be clear, he's Artos the bear. But he's actually a rabbit. He just has a bear on his banner. He's called the bear, but he's actually a rabbit. He just has a bear on his shield.
I was wondering for a second. I was like, "You have bears in your world?" I was trying to remember like the world building. It's like I don't remember there being bears.
Well, it's like an animal.
You're very careful to mention that immediately after naming him the bear.
Right, Artos the bear shows up, but he's
a rabbit.
Yeah, it's for his banner. It's a bear on his banner. He's not a bear. He's not a bear.
Artos the bear, the rabbit.
has anybody been following the social media trend lately? And I was just messaging a friend of mine that's been going around. I've seen a lot on social media about women asking their husbands, boyfriends, whatever their guys,
How often
about
you think about
how
the Roman
often
Empire?
they think about the Roman Empire.
Yep.
So and then being
2 or 3
surprised.
times a day.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's just twice a day.
Surprised because the women are like, "What? How often? Like, what exactly am I supposed to think about the Roman Empire every day?" And like all the guys, are like, "Yeah, it's typically." So today, everyone who's been watching this, we can all go, "Yep, today, I thought about the Roman Empire."
Yep.
That's funny because it's in there.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. I actually read this whole thing about Caesar when he attacked Britain. It was an amphibious attack, and the British came out into the ocean to contest them. And I was like, how has nobody written this down and made a movie out of it?
Right? One of the
Julius
very
Caesar
few.
leading a legion into the water, waiting in there, and then you've got the Britons coming out. And I was like, I need to see this. Someone needs to make a movie.
Yeah, that's one of the very few actual amphibious landings that occurred up until World War II.
I mean, it's unbelievable. So yeah, when someone's like, I bet he's thinking about other women, I'm like, that's what I'm thinking
I'm
about.
probably thinking about the Roman Empire. Yeah.
Well, you know that meme where they're laying in bed and the wife is like, I bet he's thinking about other women.
Yeah.
Right.
Think about
I know about the
Julius
rest
Turn
of
over
Caesar
and you're actually talking
amphibious
about
landing.
what the Caesar's amphibious landing and
I am falling asleep now, so
yeah, I think we should wrap.
Agree.
Is
my
there anything?
bedtime.
Let me bring up Brianna. You want to? Let me stop
Find the
screen
right.
sharing. But do you want to? I'm sorry, I thought I
Do
was
jumping
ready, and I
jacks?
was not. Yeah, you want to do
Do
jumping
a
jacks?
jumping
I'm
jacks?
sorry.
No, I'm too tired for that right now.
Not
I'm
happening.
sorry. I thought I was ready. Let me go over
Another
here.
jumping jack.
to-
Can we compromise?
Just sing a
one?
quick little song.
Just
or
one.
something
Just
while we
one.
wait.
Just give a little whistle.
There we go. Here you go, Brianna.
Okay, there's my
I'm going
website.
to put your link in here.
Um,
So wrap it up for us, Brianna.
well, if you want to follow what I'm up to, or get little behind the scenes looks at things I'm doing, and or even beta read, read stuff before anyone else. You want to go to my newsletter. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time talking. I'm genuinely so tired. And that is
Sorry for keeping you up.
Yeah, there it is. There it is. Subscribe.
Book there.
I do have a
Bye.
newsletter I send out once a month. And I don't do social media. So that's the way to keep up with me if you find me interesting for some reason.
All right.
Who find you
There you go. Links out in the comments.
You want to find out how I invented ice cream?
Need to know the story behind the invention of ice cream here.
Yes. It's all there. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Brianna. I really
Yes.
enjoyed it. So if you need to cut out, you absolutely can. I think we can wrap up. But thank you. I've really enjoyed this. You know, I want to say, actually, before you go, I want to say I'm really super impressed with this conversation. I have really enjoyed this because I think that this show, Table Talk, over the past, like I started trying to develop the show like 18 months ago. So this has been like 18 months of development of Table Talk to try to get it to its current incarnation. And this was a fantastic episode of Table Talk. It's intended to be a very intellectual and analytical space. And I think this especially came out tonight during this episode. And so I appreciate everyone who's been a part of it because that's what I was intending to create and put out on the internet. So hopefully other people will come and join us and we'll gain audience in the future. But this has really been what I was trying to create tonight. So
Mission
It was a good
accomplished.
group.
Yeah, this was awesome. I enjoyed every second of it.
I did too, and I'm always very humbled to be asked on. So,
Yeah,
Thank you,
I'm blown away by by this. Heath, thank you so much for having me on.
and thank you.
I
Doug.
really appreciate you both. Well, I mean, Brianna and Doug, they're regular guests. So I appreciate Brianna and Doug as well. But James and Sable Phoenix, especially for coming on tonight. I really appreciate your being here.
Yeah,
Your
awesome with
contribution to the
James and
conversation was
Sable.
incredible. Yeah, I know. It's
Awesome.
You all are always here anyway. And so
We are here anyway.
As much as I can be.
Doug. Here is Faraway Bird.
Buy it. Buy Faraway Bird. If you're not going to buy it, rate it. Of course, 5 stars.
I bought it twice.
You bought it twice.
I did. I bought
Yeah.
a hardback copy, and then I bought a copy for Kindle because I take notes in Kindle.
Oh, awesome. That's great. I'm working on book 2 right now. I'm free of the nonfiction analytical thing that was holding my mind in one place. And I can't wait for the second book. It's going to be a trilogy. And I honestly can't. There are so many scenes I set up in book 1 that multiple chapters that will relate to parts in future books. But anyway, if you like historical fiction, grab Faraway Bird, and I would love to know what you think.
All right. We want to know. You put it in the comment section. Let us know what you think. And then if you're interested in what I'm doing right now, here is the link to the Goodnight Sword ebook. This is my children's story. So if the first book out in Rabavania, I'm going to bring out hardback copies on Indiegogo again. But here is Goodnight Sword. If you've got a child who is of the age range who would like Goodnight Moon, remember Goodnight Moon? Well, Goodnight Sword is even better. Like, what kind of geek or nerd wouldn't want to read to their child Goodnight Sword? So if you're interested in Goodnight Sword, you can get a free copy of the book right here in PDF. You can read it. If you're looking for something to read tonight to a child, you can go right over there, download it right now, and you can be reading tonight. And then I will let you know when the Indiegogo campaign goes live, and we'll do another printing of hardback books, and I'll even sign some copies. So please check that out too. All right, everybody.
And
Thank
now,
you so much for being here.
Episode 6.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now go watch episode 6, and I guess we'll get the crew back together for episode 6. Yes, absolutely.
Doug, in the private chat, is that correct? Because when I had to close out, I lost everything.
Let me look.
I think you got
Brianna, while they're sidetracked.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. That's exactly
Dang it.
right.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks.
While they're sidetracked, I was just going to ask if the feedback that I provided was valuable.
Oh, it was so good. I'm so sorry I haven't responded yet.
No, it's okay. That's why I figured I'd ask while I have you here.
I haven't responded to any of my baby readers yet. No, thank you so much. It's because I've been focused on this thing. I'm going to.
I get it.
James's feedback is really good.
Yeah, James Bacon gave me feedback on one of my scripts. So
awesome.
Right. And I'm about to read her first script of a first draft of
different script. Yes.
soon. So yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Yes.
All right, everybody.
Cool.
Good night, everybody. I'll see everybody on Heath Geekverse channel tomorrow for the morning grind. And we'll keep going. I don't even know what day this is anymore, but like, whatever.
Thanks
Grind
so much,
on. Be
everybody. Good night.
creative. See everybody in the morning. Later.
Good night.